The morning light cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Whitmore Enterprises, like a judgment illuminating every grain of imported marble, every polished brass fixture, every carefully curated piece of modern art that announced to visitors they had entered a realm where money spoke louder than humanity. Elise Whitmore moved through this manufactured perfection with the precision of a surgeon, her Louboutin heels creating a rhythm that employees had learned to recognize from 3 corridors away, a warning system that sent junior associates scurrying to look busy and senior vice presidents checking their posture. She was 34 years old and had been CEO for 6 years, though most people assumed she had inherited the position rather than clawed her way into it through 70-hour weeks, hostile board meetings, and a ruthlessness that made her late father look merciful by comparison. The assumption stung less now than it had in the beginning. She had learned to wear their underestimation like armor, to let them think nepotism had granted her the corner office, while she systematically dismantled their quarterly projections and rebuilt entire departments overnight. The lobby was filling with the morning rush, a choreographed chaos of employees badge swiping through turnstiles, grabbing overpriced lattes from the ground floor cafe, exchanging pleasantries that meant nothing and cost everything in a corporate hierarchy where a misplaced laugh could derail a promotion. Elise observed it all from her position near the security desk, ostensibly reviewing something on her phone, but actually cataloging faces, noting who arrived at 7:45 versus 8:15, who looked exhausted versus who looked merely tired. Details mattered. Weakness could be measured in increments. That was when Noah Carter walked through the revolving door with his daughter's small hand engulfed in his larger one, and Elise felt the familiar tightness in her chest that she refused to name as anything other than irritation. The man was a contradiction that offended her sense of order. He worked in software engineering, commanded a respectable salary, possessed skills that had prevented 3 major system failures in the past 18 months alone. And yet he moved through the world with an almost deliberate disregard for appearances that suggested either profound confidence or profound stupidity. His coat was practical rather than tailored, purchased from somewhere that offered durability over designer labels. His shoes were clean but obviously old, the leather creased in ways that spoke of years of wear. His hair needed cutting, though she suspected the shagginess was more about prioritizing time than fashion. But it was the child that truly disrupted the morning's carefully maintained equilibrium. Chloe Carter was 7 years old, rail-thin with blonde hair pulled into pigtails that never quite achieved symmetry, and she wore a backpack decorated with cartoon characters that Elise vaguely recognized from commercials she fast-forwarded through on the rare occasions she watched television. The bag dwarfed her narrow shoulders, bouncing against her spine with each step as she tried to match her father's longer stride. She was chattering about something Elise was too far away to hear the specifics, but the animated hand gestures suggested enthusiasm about a school project or a playground achievement, or whatever minutiae occupied the minds of children. Elise found her voice cutting through the ambient noise before she consciously decided to speak, the words emerging with the kind of casual cruelty she had perfected over years of board meetings where mercy was weakness and sentiment was suicide. Some people just don't belong here. The statement hung in the air like smoke, visible to everyone within earshot, impossible to ignore. Conversations stuttered to silence. The barista mid-pour froze with the latte cup tilted at a precarious angle. Even the security guard looked up from his monitors with an expression that suggested he wished he were anywhere else. Noah stopped walking. His shoulders tensed in a way that Elise recognized from every previous encounter, that particular stiffening that indicated he had heard her and was choosing his response with the care of someone defusing a bomb. His jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath skin that needed shaving, and his hand squeezed his daughter's fingers just a fraction tighter. Chloe looked up at her father, confusion transforming her animated expression into something smaller and more uncertain. Her voice carried in the unnatural silence, high and worried, in exactly the kind of vulnerability that made Elise want to look away. "Daddy, did we do something wrong?" Noah bent down, his face level with his daughter's, and Elise could see him manufacturing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The tenderness in the gesture was nauseating in its purity, the way he smoothed one of her crooked pigtails and murmured something too quiet for Elise to hear. Whatever he said seemed to satisfy the girl because Chloe nodded and clutched her backpack straps as they continued toward the elevator bank, Noah's hand never leaving her shoulder. Elise had already turned away, by then her phone back in her hand, as if nothing significant had occurred, as if she hadn't just reminded a single father that his presence and his daughters disrupted the pristine professionalism she demanded from her domain. She strode toward her private elevator, the one that bypassed all 47 floors, and delivered her directly to the executive suite, her heels creating that distinctive rhythm that announced her departure as clearly as her arrival. Behind her, one of the receptionists leaned toward her colleague, her whisper somehow amplified in the marble acoustics. She does that every morning, every single time he brings the kid. The other receptionist made a non-committal sound that might have been agreement or merely acknowledgement. Elise heard it all. She always did. The building's architecture, for all its modern beauty, had been designed to carry sound in unexpected ways, a feature she had discovered during her first month as CEO when she overheard two board members plotting her removal in what they assumed was a private conversation 3 floors below her office. She had learned to weaponize the building's acoustic quirks to position herself where whispers became intelligence. She stepped into her private elevator, the doors closing with a pneumatic hiss that sealed her away from the lobby and its judgments. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished steel interior, dark hair pulled into a chignon so tight it gave her headaches by noon, makeup applied with the precision of war, paint a silk blouse the color of dried blood tucked into tailored black trousers that cost more than most of her employees made in a month. She looked exactly like what she had designed herself to become, untouchable, unbreakable, utterly alone. The elevator climbed, and with each passing floor, Elise felt the familiar settling of her armor back into place. The momentary discomfort she had experienced watching Noah comfort his daughter evaporated, replaced by the cold satisfaction of maintaining boundaries. This was a business, not a daycare. If he couldn't manage his personal responsibilities without bleeding them into company time, perhaps he wasn't as indispensable as his performance reviews suggested. The morning progressed with the mechanical efficiency Elise demanded from her schedule. 8 o'clock meeting with the CFO about quarterly projections, where she reduced him to stammering apologies over a 2% shortfall that she knew was actually due to her own aggressive expansion into the Asian market, but accountability needed to be public and painful to be effective. 9:15 conference call with the London office, where she spoke over the managing director 3 times before he stopped trying to sugarcoat bad news. 10:30 review of personnel files for an upcoming round of performance evaluations, where she made notes in the margins that would determine careers and mortgages and whether someone's daughter got braces this year. By 11, she needed air. The executive floor had its own private terrace, a rectangle of carefully maintained greenery that served no practical purpose beyond providing executives somewhere to smoke expensive cigars and complain about their golf handicaps. Elise rarely used it, finding the aesthetic too self-consciously relaxing, but this morning she felt the walls closing in with an intensity that suggested her morning espresso had been stronger than intended. She pushed through the glass doors and immediately regretted it. Noah Carter stood near the far railing, his back to her, one hand holding his phone to his ear, while the other gestured in that unconscious way people did when describing something they couldn't see. He was speaking quietly, but the terrace's open air carried his words with unfortunate clarity. "I know, Mrs. Patterson. I appreciate you taking her after school. The program is closed for teacher training, and I didn't have anyone else." A pause while he listened to whatever response his neighbor offered, and Elise found herself frozen near the door, unable to retreat without making her presence obvious, unwilling to advance and announce herself. She was trapped in an accidental eavesdropping that felt more invasive than any she had deliberately engineered. "No, her mother hasn't called in 6 months. I stopped expecting it after the first year." Another pause, longer this time, and Noah's shoulders dropped in a way that suggested exhaustion so profound it had settled into his bones. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that Elise recognized from her own 3 a.m. moments, when the apartment was too quiet and the city lights outside her window felt like audience members waiting for her to admit failure. "Some days I wonder if I'm doing any of this right. If Chloe deserves better than a father who brings her to the office because he can't afford the private care that never has closures or half days. She's 7 and she's already learned to be quiet in corners so nobody notices her. What kind of childhood is that Elise should have left then?" Every instinct she had carefully cultivated over the past decade screamed at her to retreat, to pretend she had never heard this moment of vulnerability, to maintain the careful distance between employer and employee that prevented complications and preserved hierarchy. But something kept her motionless. her hand still on the door handle, her breath shallow in her chest as she listened to this man confess his failures to a woman who probably baked him casseroles and told him that he was doing fine. "You're right," Noah continued, and now there was something almost like a laugh in his voice, though it carried no humor. "She is a great kid. Sometimes I think she's the only thing I've ever done that actually mattered." He ended the call, then lowering the phone and standing for a moment with his head bowed, his hand gripping the railing hard enough that his knuckles went white. Elise watched him gather himself, watched him physically straighten his spine and roll his shoulders back and reconstruct whatever persona he wore to survive his days in an office where the CEO mocked him in lobbies. She left before he could turn around and discover her presence slipping back through the door with a quietness that felt uncomfortably like cowardice. The afternoon brought its own particular torments. At 2, Elise had scheduled a department head meeting that devolved into the usual territorial disputes and budget complaints that made her wonder if evolution had somehow skipped middle management entirely. At 3:30, she found herself walking past the third-floor break room, where Chloe sat at a small table in the corner, her homework spread across the surface in careful organization that suggested her father had taught her systems for managing chaos. The girl was working through math problems, her tongue poking out between her teeth in concentration, her pencil gripped with the awkward intensity of someone still learning to control fine motor skills. She had positioned herself as far from the coffee machine and microwave as possible, clearly understanding that she needed to minimize her presence to become invisible in a space designed for adults taking hurried breaks between meetings. Elise paused in the doorway, watching this small person trying to disappear, and felt something uncomfortable twist in her chest that she refused to identify as guilt. The child wasn't bothering anyone. She was quieter than most of the employees who used this break room, who laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny and complained about workloads while spending 20 minutes debating fantasy football trades. "This is a workplace," Elise heard herself announce to no one in particular, though 2 junior analysts stood near the refrigerator with their lunches, and they immediately straightened at the sound of her voice. "Not an elementary school study hall." Chloe looked up, her blue eyes wide and startled, her pencil stilling mid-calculation. She didn't say anything, didn't defend her presence, or apologize for existing in a space that technically any employee could use during designated break periods. She just looked at Elise with that unfiltered directness children possessed before life taught them to guard their expressions. One of the analysts opened his mouth as if to speak, then apparently reconsidered the wisdom of contradicting the CEO. They both gathered their lunch containers and fled with the urgency of people escaping disaster, leaving Elise alone in the doorway with a 7-year-old who was now carefully gathering her homework with trembling hands. "You don't have to leave," Elise found herself saying, the words emerging before her executive brain could veto them. "Just keep the noise down." Chloe nodded, her pigtails bouncing, and bent back over her math worksheet with renewed focus that suggested she was pouring all her concentration into the numbers to avoid thinking about whatever had just happened. Elise stood for a moment longer, watching this child pretend she wasn't moments away from tears, before turning and walking back toward the elevator with a haste that felt like retreat. That evening, as the office emptied and the sun painted long shadows across the marble lobby, Noah appeared at Elise's office door with a folder of reports she had requested that morning. He knocked twice on the glass, waiting for her gesture before entering, and Elise noted with irritation that he looked calm, collected, completely unruffled by the day's series of humiliations. "The reports you wanted," he offered, setting the folder on the edge of her desk rather than presuming to place it directly in front of her. "Network security protocols for the new client database. I flagged the sections that need executive approval." Elise opened the folder without looking at him, scanning the first page with the kind of focused attention that usually prompted visitors to excuse themselves and leave her to work in peace. But Noah remained standing across from her desk, his hands in his pockets, his expression carefully neutral. "Is there something else?" she asked without lifting her gaze from the document. A pause that stretched just long enough to become noticeable. Then his voice came measured and even. "I'd appreciate it if you would direct your criticisms at me rather than my daughter. She's 7 years old. She doesn't understand corporate dynamics or why her presence here bothers you." Elise finally looked up, her pen stilling on the margin where she had been making notes. Noah met her eyes without flinching, though she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had balled into loose fists inside his pockets. "Your daughter is here because you can't separate your personal life from your professional responsibilities." Elise replied, her tone flat and factual. That's not my problem to solve. No, it's not. But taking out your frustration with me on a child is beneath you. The statement hit harder than he probably intended, or perhaps exactly as hard as he meant it to, because Elise felt something in her chest constrict with an intensity that bordered on physical pain, beneath her. As if he knew what depths she had plumbed, what compromises she had made, what pieces of herself she had systematically discarded to build the reputation she now wielded like a weapon. Get out. Noah held her gaze for another beat, then nodded once and turned toward the door. He paused at the threshold, his hand on the frame, and spoke without looking back. She drew you a picture, you know, last night, after dinner. She drew you wearing a crown because she thinks that's what bosses look like in fairy tales. Then he was gone, the door closing with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam, and Elise was left alone with her reports and the sudden, unwelcome realization that she couldn't remember the last time anyone had drawn her a picture, crowned or otherwise. The following morning arrived with the same relentless punctuality that governed everything in Elise's carefully ordered existence. She woke at 5:30 to her alarm's insistent chime, completed 30 minutes of bar exercises that left her muscles trembling and her mind blissfully empty, showered in water that never quite got hot enough, despite the building's premium plumbing, and dressed in another variation of the uniform she had constructed for herself, severe tailoring in darker colors. Minimal jewelry, shoes that added 3 inches to her height and brought her eye level with most of the men who tried to intimidate her in conference rooms. By 7, she was in her office reviewing overnight emails from the Tokyo branch, where a contract negotiation had gone sideways in ways that suggested someone wasn't reading the language carefully enough or was deliberately mistranslating to serve their own agenda. She was composing a tersely worded directive when her assistant knocked and entered, without waiting for acknowledgement, which meant the situation required immediate attention. There's a child in the lobby, Miranda announced, her expression caught between professional concern and barely suppressed amusement. Waiting by the executive elevator. She has something for you. Elise looked up from her screen, irritation flaring automatic and immediate. If this is some kind of charity drive or school fundraiser, it's Chloe Carter, Noah's daughter. The irritation transformed into something else, something Elise didn't have vocabulary for, because she had spent years eliminating such responses from her emotional repertoire. She saved the email draft without finishing it and stood smoothing her skirt with hands that felt less steady than they should have been. The executive elevator opened onto the lobby with its usual pneumatic precision, and there stood Chloe, small and determined, her backpack still too large for her frame, her father hovering several feet away, with an expression that suggested he had tried to talk her out of whatever mission she had appointed herself to complete. The morning rush swirled around them, employees flowing past on their way to elevators and coffee, and another day of carefully calibrated productivity. But Chloe stood rooted near the executive elevator bank, like a tiny soldier awaiting orders. She clutched a folded piece of paper in both hands, holding it against her chest with the kind of precious care usually reserved for irreplaceable treasures. When she saw Elise approach, her eyes went wide, and for a terrible moment, Elise thought the child might lose her nerve entirely and flee. But instead, Chloe stepped forward with the kind of courage that only came from not yet understanding how badly the world could hurt you. "This is for you," she announced, her voice carrying in the marble acoustics with unfortunate clarity. Several nearby employees stopped to watch their morning routines disrupted by the unexpected theater of a child confronting the CEO. Elise stared at the offering, this piece of folded paper extended toward her like a peace treaty or a declaration of war, or perhaps both simultaneously. Every instinct screamed at her to dismiss it, to walk past this child and into her private elevator and let the moment dissipate into office gossip that would be forgotten by lunch. But she found her hand reaching out, accepting the paper with fingers that felt clumsy and uncertain. "What is this?" The question emerged more sharply than intended, a defense mechanism activated by proximity to vulnerability. Chloe's expression didn't falter, though Elise saw her father tense several feet away, his body language broadcasting readiness to intervene if necessary. "It's a thank you card for letting my daddy work here." The statement was so earnest, so completely devoid of irony or manipulation, that Elise felt something crack in the careful architecture of her morning composure. She unfolded the paper with movements that felt mechanical, revealing a crayon drawing that would have been unremarkable in any elementary school classroom. But here in this marble lobby, surrounded by imported art, and six-figure salaries seemed almost obscene in its innocence. The drawing depicted three figures in the primary color simplicity of child art: a stick figure woman with dark hair wearing what appeared to be a triangle dress, a taller stick figure man, and a smaller stick figure girl with yellow pigtails. Above the woman's head floated a crude crown, each point carefully colored in gold crayon. Below the drawing in handwriting that showed the careful concentration of someone still mastering cursive were the words, "Thank you for being nice to my daddy." Elise's throat closed. The lobby sounds, conversations and footsteps, and the hiss of the espresso machine receded to a distant hum that might have been tinnitus or might have been the sound of something fundamental breaking inside her chest cavity. She stared at this child's drawing, this artifact of gratitude offered for kindness that Elise had never actually provided, and felt the weight of her own cruelty settle across her shoulders like a physical burden. "I drew you with a crown because you're the boss," Chloe continued, apparently interpreting Elise's silence as interest rather than paralysis. "My daddy says you're the smartest person in the whole building. That's like being a queen, right?" Elise forced herself to look up from the drawing to meet this child's eyes that held nothing but hope and trust and a belief that adults were fundamentally good if you just tried hard enough to reach them. She wanted to explain that the crown was accurate, but not in the way Chloe imagined, that queens in the real world ruled through fear, rather than benevolence, that intelligence was a weapon best wielded from distance. But the words lodged in her throat, refusing articulation. "Fine," she managed finally, the single syllable emerging flat and dismissive. She refolded the drawing without looking at it again and turned toward her elevator, each step requiring conscious effort, as if her body had forgotten how to execute basic motor functions. Behind her, she heard Noah's quiet voice praising his daughter for being brave, heard Chloe's excited chatter about what they should have for dinner, heard the normal sounds of a father and daughter navigating their morning with the kind of easy intimacy that Elise had never known and had convinced herself she didn't miss. The elevator doors closed, sealing her away from the lobby and its witnesses, and she sagged against the steel wall as the car climbed toward the executive floor. She should have thrown the drawing away. There was a recycling bin in the elevator designed for executives who needed to dispose of sensitive documents between floors. She could have dropped it there, eliminated the evidence of this moment, returned to her office and her emails, and the comfortable familiar of corporate warfare, where the rules were clear and mercy was weakness. Instead, she found herself smoothing the paper flat against her thigh, pressing out the creases she had just created, treating this crayon drawing with more care than she had shown most things in the past decade. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, she walked to her office with the drawing held carefully in both hands, aware of Miranda's curious gaze, tracking her progress but unwilling to offer explanation or deflection. She set the drawing on her desk, positioning it next to her keyboard, where she would see it every time she looked up from her work. The crude crown stared back at her, all gold crayon and childish optimism, a reminder of every way she had failed to earn the title this little girl had bestowed upon her. Elise sat in her chair and opened her laptop and tried to return her attention to the Tokyo negotiation that still required her intervention, but her eyes kept drifting back to the drawing, to the stick figure woman wearing a crown, to the words thanking her for kindness she had never shown. Outside her office, the morning progressed with its usual controlled chaos, phones ringing, keyboards clattering, the muted sound of conversations conducted at professional volumes. Inside her glass-walled sanctuary, Elise sat motionless, staring at a child's drawing and feeling the first tremors of something she had spent years suppressing, doubt that the person she had become was the person she actually wanted to be. The day continued with its relentless momentum, dragging Elise through meetings and decisions and the thousand small cruelties that corporate leadership demanded. But now every interaction carried an additional weight. Every curt email and dismissive comment felt like evidence being compiled against her in some cosmic tribunal, where a 7-year-old's drawing served as Exhibit A in the case for her inadequacy as a human being. At lunch, she ate alone in her office, as always, a salad from the executive dining room that tasted like expensive nothing, her eyes continually drawn to the drawing that she should have buried in a drawer, but had instead left prominently displayed where anyone walking past her glass walls could see it. Miranda knocked and entered at 1:15, carrying a stack of documents that needed signatures and wearing an expression that suggested she had questions she was too professional to ask. These need to be filed by 3, Miranda explained, setting the stack on the desk's corner, her gaze flickering to the drawing and then away with studied neutrality. Also, the board wants to schedule a review meeting for next week. Victor Hammond specifically requested attendance. Of course he did. Victor Hammond had been circling for months looking for any weakness he could exploit to justify a leadership change that would benefit his portfolio and his ego in equal measure. A board review meant scrutiny, meant defending decisions she had already defended 3 times, meant preparing for a battle where her opponents would smile while sharpening knives. Schedule it for Tuesday. Elise responded, reaching for her pen to begin working through the document stack. Morning session if possible. I want them tired and hungry when they start asking questions. Miranda made a note on her tablet, then hesitated in that way that indicated she was about to overstep the boundaries of executive assistant propriety. Permission to speak candidly, she asked, her voice dropping to a tone reserved for conversations that never officially happened. Elise looked up, pen stilling. That drawing. From the little girl this morning. People are talking. Of course they were. The office grapevine operated with the efficiency of any well-designed intelligence network, distributing information and speculation with equal enthusiasm. By now, every employee from the mailroom to the C-suite probably knew that the CEO had accepted a drawing from Noah Carter's daughter, and the various factions would be busy constructing narratives that fit their preferred interpretation of events. Let them talk, Elise replied, returning her attention to the documents. It's just a drawing, is it? Miranda asked, and there was something in her voice that made Elise look up again. Something that suggested her assistant saw more than Elise wanted visible. Because you've never displayed anything personal in your office before. Not in the 6 years I've worked for you. No photos, no mementos, nothing that suggests you exist beyond these walls. And now there's a child's drawing next to your keyboard. Elise felt defensive mechanisms activating, walls rising to protect the vulnerable spaces she preferred to keep armored against inspection. Your point. My point is that people are wondering if it means something. If you're softening, the word landed like an accusation, and Elise felt anger flash hot and immediate through her chest. Softening suggested weakness, suggested the careful persona she had constructed was cracking in ways that enemies like Victor Hammond could exploit. Softening meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant destruction. Tell people to focus on their work instead of speculating about mine. Elise snapped her pen, attacking the first document with enough force to tear through the paper. And if anyone has concerns about my leadership, they can address them at next week's board meeting. Miranda nodded clearly, recognizing the dismissal, and retreated from the office with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to navigate her boss's moods through long experience. The door closed, leaving Elise alone with her signatures and her thoughts and the drawing that she should absolutely remove from her desk, but found herself unable to touch. She worked through the afternoon with grim determination, returning calls and reviewing reports and making decisions that would affect hundreds of lives in ways those people would never directly connect to her name. This was the power she had fought for, the influence she had sacrificed so much to achieve, the ability to shape outcomes, to redirect resources, to determine who succeeded and who struggled, based on assessments she delivered with clinical precision. But now every decision felt heavier, weighted with the awareness of consequences that extended beyond quarterly reports and stock prices. When she reviewed a layoff proposal for the manufacturing division, she found herself wondering how many of those employees had children. How many were single parents navigating the impossible mathematics of childcare and work schedules? When she approved budget cuts to the facilities department, she thought about the janitors whose names Noah apparently knew, the cleaning staff who worked overnight shifts, so their kids could sleep in real beds instead of break room corners. The thoughts were intrusive and unwelcome, disrupting the careful compartmentalization she relied on to function in a role that required making difficult choices without drowning in sentiment. She pushed them away with practiced efficiency, but they kept returning like waves against a deteriorating seawall, persistent and inexorable and impossible to permanently repel. At 4:30, she decided she needed coffee, or possibly air, or possibly an excuse to leave her office and its glass walls and the feeling that she was being observed by invisible judges who found her wanting. She took the stairs instead of the elevator, descending 3 floors to the executive break room that offered better espresso than the general employee facilities and came with the unspoken rule that junior staff avoided it during peak hours. The break room was empty when she arrived, the espresso machine humming its idle readiness, the afternoon sun slanting through windows that overlooked the Boston cityscape with its tangle of old architecture and new money. Elise was setting up her cup measuring grounds with the precision she applied to everything when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. 2 voices male speaking with the casual volume of people who assumed privacy. Elise recognized them immediately. David Chen and Marcus Wright, senior developers who had been with the company for 5 years and consistently received performance ratings that kept them employed but never promoted. They were competent but unremarkable, the kind of employees who filled necessary roles without ever quite distinguishing themselves. They entered the break room, still mid-conversation, so focused on their discussion that they didn't immediately notice Elise standing at the espresso machine. She should have announced her presence, should have cleared her throat, or made some other indication that they were not alone. But something kept her silent, curious about what people said when they thought the CEO wasn't listening. "I'm just saying, single dad, and all you'd think the company could cut him some slack," Marcus was saying as he headed for the refrigerator. "Did you see his wallet yesterday? Thing looked like it survived a war." David laughed, opening a cabinet to retrieve coffee filters. "Right? And bringing the kid to work because he can't afford proper childcare. I mean, I get it's tough, but at some point you have to wonder if he's really committed to the job or just collecting a paycheck between parenting emergencies." The words hit Elise like a physical blow, not because they were particularly cruel by corporate standards, but because she recognized the tone, casual dismissal, easy mockery, the kind of thoughtless commentary that people engaged in when discussing someone they considered inferior to their own circumstances. She had heard similar conversations dozens of times, had participated in them herself, when targeting underperforming departments, or questioning someone's commitment based on metrics that had nothing to do with actual capability. But now listening to these men laugh about Noah's worn wallet and his childcare struggles, she felt something dark and furious coil in her chest, something that had been building since the morning she saw Chloe's drawing and realized exactly what kind of queen she had become. "Maybe we should start a charity fund," Marcus continued, his voice thick with false sympathy. "Poor single dad, can't keep a wife, can't afford a nanny. What's next? Asking for company donations to buy him a new wallet." They both laughed, and the sound scraped against something raw in Elise's chest, something she had been trying to ignore since watching Noah bend down to comfort his confused daughter in the lobby, since hearing him confess his doubts to a neighbor on a phone call he thought was private, since accepting a drawing from a child who believed adults were fundamentally good. Enough. The word cracked through the break room like a whip, sharp and absolute, and carrying enough authority that both men jerked to attention as if physically struck. They spun to face her coffee, forgotten expressions, cycling through surprise to recognition, to the dawning horror of employees who had just been caught speaking freely about a colleague in front of the one person who could end careers with a signature. Elise set her espresso cup down with deliberate care, the porcelain clicking against the counter, with a finality that suggested executions at dawn. She stepped toward them slowly, each footfall measured and precise, giving them time to fully comprehend the depth of their miscalculation. "Miss Whitmore, we didn't—" David started, but she cut him off with a gesture that brooked no interruption. "I heard exactly what you said, both of you, and now you're going to listen to what I have to say." They stood frozen, 2 men in their 30s who made comfortable 6-figure salaries and probably went home to wives and houses in suburbs where lawns needed mowing and kids needed homework. Help men who had never had to make the choices Noah made every day, men who had the luxury of mocking someone else's struggles because they had never experienced genuine hardship. Noah Carter has been with this company for 3 years. Elise began, her voice low and controlled, in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting. In that time, he has prevented 2 major security breaches that would have cost us millions in damages and reputation. He has trained 6 junior developers who are now performing at levels that exceed initial projections. He has worked more overtime hours than any other engineer in his department, often staying past midnight to ensure system stability before major launches. She paused, letting the statistics sink in, watching their faces as they realized this wasn't going to be a quick reprimand they could apologize away. He does all of this while raising a daughter alone because his ex-wife abandoned them both for a life that apparently didn't include motherhood or accountability. He arranges his schedule to accommodate school closures and pediatrician appointments and the thousand other responsibilities that come with being a single parent. And he never not once uses any of this as an excuse for substandard performance. Marcus opened his mouth as if to speak, but Elise's glare silenced him before sound could form. So when I hear two senior developers, men who have never demonstrated the kind of dedication or capability that Noah shows every day, mocking him for having an old wallet or needing flexible childcare arrangements, what I hear is a fundamental failure to understand what actual commitment looks like. The break room had gone silent, except for the hum of the espresso machine and the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below. David's face had gone pale while Marcus stared at his shoes with the intensity of someone hoping the floor would open and swallow him whole. If I ever, Elise continued, her voice dropping to something dangerous, hear either of you discussing a colleague's personal circumstances, again, not just Noah's, but anyone's, you will both be updating your resumes by end of day. We clear? Yes, ma'am, they said in unison, the response automatic and terrified. And Elise felt a dark satisfaction at their fear that she immediately hated herself for enjoying. Get back to work. They fled with the graceless haste of people escaping immediate danger, their coffee forgotten, their afternoon break abandoned, in favor of reaching the safety of their cubicles, where the CEO's wrath couldn't follow. Elise stood alone in the break room, her hands trembling with adrenaline and something else, something that felt uncomfortably like righteousness mixed with shame. She had defended Noah. Actually defended him not with the calculated political maneuvering she employed in board meetings, but with genuine anger at people who had dared to mock his struggles. She had weaponized her authority on his behalf, used the very power she typically reserved for corporate warfare to protect someone who had never asked for her protection and probably didn't want it. The realization made her feel simultaneously powerful and pathetic, strong and weak, like she had won a battle while exposing a vulnerability that enemies could exploit. She left her espresso cup on the counter unwanted now and returned to the stairs that would carry her back to her office and its glass walls and the drawing that stared at her with its crude crown and impossible expectations. The climb felt longer than the descent, each step requiring effort that suggested exhaustion beyond mere physical fatigue. When she reached her floor, she found Noah standing near her office door, talking to Miranda about something technical that required him to gesture at his tablet screen. He looked up when she approached, and their eyes met for a beat that stretched longer than casual acknowledgement, shorter than actual conversation. His expression was unreadable, carefully neutral in the way she recognized from every interaction they had ever had, but something in his posture suggested he knew what had just happened 3 floors below. Office gossip moved at the speed of light, and traumatized developers probably couldn't resist sharing the story of their humiliation at the CEO's hands, not realizing or perhaps not caring that Noah would inevitably hear about it. Miss Whitmore, he said, his voice level and professional. I was just dropping off the network analysis you requested. Thank you, she replied, equally formal, and gestured for him to follow her into the office. Miranda watched them with interest, poorly disguised as administrative efficiency, and Elise made a mental note to have a conversation about appropriate curiosity levels in executive assistants. Noah entered her office and closed the door with a care that suggested he understood this was about to become a private conversation, whether he wanted it or not. He stood across from her desk, hands in pockets, waiting for her to speak first, which she appreciated because she had no idea what she actually wanted to say. I heard about what happened in the break room, he finally offered when the silence stretched too long. David sent an apologetic email about 15 minutes ago. Very thorough, lots of capitalized words like regret and inappropriate. Elise circled her desk and sat suddenly exhausted by the day and its emotional landmines, by the constant effort of maintaining personas that felt increasingly like ill-fitting clothes. They were out of line. Yes, they were. Noah's voice remained even, giving nothing away. But you didn't have to defend me. The statement hung between them, not quite accusation, not quite gratitude, just observation of a fact that they both recognized as departure from their established pattern. Elise looked at him, really looked at him for perhaps the first time since he started working at Whitmore Enterprises, seeing past the worn coat and the too long hair, to the person who came to work every day and did his job with quiet competence and raised his daughter with a devotion that Elise had spent weeks mocking. No, she admitted finally, I didn't have to, but I wanted to. The confession emerged more honestly than intended, stripping away the corporate justifications and political reasoning she could have offered in favor of raw admission. Noah's expression flickered something passing through his eyes that might have been surprise or confusion or the beginning of understanding that their dynamic had shifted in ways neither of them had consciously chosen. Why the question was gentle, genuinely curious rather than challenging. Elise looked at the drawing on her desk at Chloe's careful crayon work and her earnest gratitude for kindness that Elise hadn't earned and felt something crack wider in her carefully maintained armor. Because they were wrong about you, about your priorities, about what commitment actually looks like. She paused, choosing her next words with the care of someone navigating a minefield. And because I'm tired of people thinking cruelty is the same thing as strength. Noah was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but stubbornly refusing to give him that satisfaction. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a warmth she wasn't expecting. Thank you for defending me even if I didn't ask for it, even if it probably made your day more complicated. It always makes my day more complicated, Elise replied, but there was no edge to the words, just tired acknowledgement of truth. Your presence here has been a complication since the day you started bringing your daughter through the lobby. I know. Noah's smile was small and sad and somehow kind despite everything. I'm sorry about that. Don't be, she found herself saying, and meant it more than she wanted to examine. Your daughter drew me wearing a crown. That's more credit than I've earned in a long time. He nodded as if this made perfect sense, as if they weren't two people who had spent months in a dynamic of criticism and stoic acceptance that should have precluded this kind of conversation. Then he reached into his tablet case and withdrew another piece of folded paper, this one obviously newer, the creases fresh. She made you something else, he said, setting it on her desk next to the drawing already there. Last night after the first one, I told her you probably wouldn't want another picture, but she was very insistent that you needed this one specifically. Elise stared at the folded paper like it might detonate, then carefully picked it up and opened it. This drawing showed two stick figures, one tall with dark hair and a crown, one small with blonde pigtails, holding hands beneath a sun with a smiley face. Below in Chloe's careful printing, friends. The word hit harder than any board meeting, criticism, any stockholder challenge, any calculated insult Victor Hammond had ever delivered. Friends with a question mark, as if this 7-year-old understood that friendship required consent, required choice, required both parties to want the connection. Elise felt tears threatening and forced them back through sheer discipline, refusing to cry in front of an employee over a child's drawing, no matter how directly it targeted every defense she had built against exactly this kind of vulnerability. Tell her yes, Elise whispered, and her voice came out rougher than intended. Tell her I'd like that very much. Noah smiled, then a real smile that transformed his tired face into something almost beautiful, and Elise understood with sudden clarity why his daughter loved him so fiercely, why he inspired loyalty from subordinates who worked overtime without complaint, why people who barely knew him spoke his name with respect. I'll tell her, he promised. Fair warning though, once you agree to be Chloe's friend, you're committed. She takes these things very seriously. I imagine she does, Elise replied, and found herself smiling back despite everything, despite the day and the confrontation and the way her careful world was being systematically dismantled by a 7-year-old with crayons and impossible faith in human goodness. Noah left, then closing the door quietly behind him, and Elise was alone with two drawings that she positioned side by side on her desk, like evidence in a trial where she served as both defendant and jury. She stared at the stick figures and their crude crowns and their question mark friendship, and felt something fundamental shifting in her understanding of what strength actually meant. The office continued its evening wind-down around her people, leaving for commutes and dinner plans and lives that extended beyond these walls. Miranda knocked to ask if she needed anything else, received a headshake, and departed with a knowing look that Elise was too tired to decipher. The sun sank lower, painting the city in golds and reds that suggested endings and beginnings in equal measure. Elise worked late as always, responding to the Tokyo emails that had accumulated during her day, preparing notes for next week's board review that would determine whether Victor Hammond's maneuvering had gained enough traction to threaten her position. But between each task, her eyes drifted to those drawings, and each time she felt a little more of her certainty eroding, a little more of her carefully constructed persona revealing itself as costume rather than character. At 9, she finally gathered her things and prepared to leave. She should have left the drawings on her desk, where anyone passing by could see them, could speculate about what they meant and whether the Ice Queen was melting. Instead, she found herself carefully folding both pieces of paper and tucking them into her briefcase, carrying them with her as she rode the elevator down to the parking garage where her Mercedes waited in its reserved spot. The drive home took 20 minutes through traffic that never really stopped in Boston, just shifted from gridlock to merely heavy, depending on the hour. Her apartment occupied the top floor of a converted historic building in Back Bay, all exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that cost more per piece than most people made in a month. It was beautiful and impersonal, a space designed to impress visitors who never came and showcase tastes that she had cultivated from magazines and design blogs rather than any genuine personal preference. She poured herself a glass of wine that she didn't really want and stood at the window overlooking the city, her reflection staring back from the glass, a woman in expensive clothes with perfect posture and tired eyes, a woman who had achieved every professional goal she had set for herself and somehow ended up lonelier than she had been before any of it started. The drawings sat in her briefcase on the entry table, and she found herself walking back to retrieve them, smoothing them flat on her kitchen counter, as if they were important documents requiring preservation. She studied Chloe's careful work, the way she had drawn the smiley-faced sun, the way she had connected the stick figure's hands with a thick crayon line that suggested permanence. Friends with a question mark, as if afraid of rejection, as if believing that adults might not want to be friends with 7-year-olds who understood the world in primary colors and uncomplicated kindness. Elise picked up her phone and opened a text thread that she rarely used, her father's number still saved, despite the fact that he had been dead for 4 years. She had kept his final message sent 3 days before the stroke that killed him in his office, surrounded by quarterly reports and stock tickers. Never let them see you care. It's the only advantage you have. She stared at those words now, at the philosophy she had internalized so completely. It had become indistinguishable from her own thoughts, and felt a wave of something that might have been grief or might have been rage at the life he had convinced her she needed to live. Her father had been wrong, or perhaps not wrong, but incomplete, offering survival strategies that came at costs he had never calculated because he had never valued the things they destroyed. He had taught her to be invulnerable, and in doing so had made her incapable of connection. He had shown her how to win, but never mentioned that victories could be hollow when celebrated alone. Elise deleted his message. The action took 5 seconds, a few taps on her screen, but it felt like dismantling a monument that had stood for decades. She stood in her expensive kitchen with her overpriced wine and her empty apartment and felt lighter than she had in years, as if she had been carrying weight she didn't know could be set down. She took a picture of both drawings and sent them to her private email with the subject line, "Evidence," and no body text, creating a backup in case the originals got damaged or lost. Then she carefully placed them in a drawer in her bedroom, tucked between silk scarves she never wore and costume jewelry that had seemed important when purchased, but revealed itself as unnecessary when actually owned. Sleep came eventually, though her dreams were fragmented in strange crowns made of crayon children with pigtails asking questions she didn't know how to answer, her father's office filling with sunlight and the sound of laughter she couldn't quite place. She woke at 5:30 as always, but for the first time in years she hit the snooze button and allowed herself 10 extra minutes of rest that felt simultaneously indulgent and necessary. The office waited with its usual demands, its performance reviews and budget meetings, and the constant chess game of corporate politics, where every move carried consequences that rippled through departments and paychecks and lives she would never directly touch. But now, as Elise dressed in her armor of silk and tailoring, as she gathered her briefcase and her phone and her perfectly prepared facade, she carried something new with her, the knowledge that a 7-year-old thought she could be someone's friend, and the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that maybe against all evidence and expectation, Chloe might be right. The morning lobby ritual played out with its usual choreography, employees flowing through turnstiles with badges and coffee, and the practiced efficiency of people executing learned routines. Elise stood near the elevator bank, ostensibly reviewing something on her phone, but actually watching for Noah and his daughter, with an attention she refused to acknowledge as anticipation. They appeared at 7:53, slightly later than usual, Noah looking more harried than typical, and Chloe's pigtails distinctly asymmetrical in a way that suggested a rushed morning. They moved through the lobby with purpose, Noah clearly focused on reaching his floor before some deadline or meeting, and Elise found herself stepping directly into their path with an impulse that bypassed all executive training. Noah stopped, surprise flickering across his face before professional neutrality reasserted itself. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore." Elise looked at him, then at Chloe, who had frozen in that particular way children did when they weren't sure if they were in trouble or not. The girl clutched her backpack straps, her blue eyes wide and uncertain, clearly remembering yesterday's drawing delivery and probably expecting some new variation of adult incomprehensibility. "Good morning," Elise replied, and then did something she hadn't done in 6 years as CEO. She crouched down, bringing herself to Chloe's eye level, despite the fact that her skirt was too tight for this kind of movement, and her heels made balance precarious. "I received your second drawing, the one with the question." Chloe nodded, her expression caught between hope and fear. Elise held out her hand, palm up, an offering and an invitation. "Yes," she said simply. "Friends." For a moment, nothing moved except the normal flow of lobby traffic around them, employees giving them space and curious looks in equal measure. Then Chloe's face split into a grin, so wide and genuine that Elise felt something in her chest expand to painful proportions, and the little girl placed her small hand in Elise's larger one with a trust that felt both precious and terrifying. "Really?" Chloe asked, as if needing verbal confirmation of what had just been physically demonstrated. "Really," Elise confirmed and squeezed the small hand gently before releasing it and standing with considerably less grace than she had achieved in the descent. Noah was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, surprise mixed with something that might have been gratitude or might have been concern that his daughter was getting attached to someone who had spent months demonstrating exactly how cruel authority could be. "Thank you," he said quietly, and Elise knew he meant for more than just this moment, meant for the drawing she had kept, in the defense she had offered, and the small gesture of friendship she had just extended to a 7-year-old who deserved kindness from adults who were supposed to know better. "Don't thank me yet," Elise replied, but there was no edge to it, just tired honesty. "I'm not very good at this." "None of us are," Noah said. "We just keep trying anyway." They stood for another beat in the lobby, three people caught in a moment that felt simultaneously too exposed and exactly right, before Chloe tugged on her father's hand and reminded him they needed to get to his office before her homework hour started. Noah nodded, offered Elise a small smile that she found herself returning, and they continued toward the elevators, while Elise stood alone again, watching them go and feeling like she had just made a choice that couldn't be unmade. Miranda was waiting when Elise reached her office, holding the morning schedule and wearing an expression that suggested she had witnessed the lobby interaction and had opinions about it that would eventually find their way into conversation. "Your 8 o'clock is here early," Miranda announced. "Also, Victor Hammond call on. He wants to move up the board review to Thursday instead of Tuesday. Says he has new information that requires immediate discussion." Of course he did. Victor had probably heard about yesterday's break room defense, had probably already constructed a narrative about how the CEO's judgment was being compromised by inappropriate personal entanglements with subordinates. The board review would be a bloodbath, questions about professional boundaries and leadership compromised by sentiment, and Elise would need to defend her position while simultaneously explaining why she had publicly berated two senior developers for mocking an engineer's personal circumstances. "Thursday is fine," Elise replied, settling behind her desk where the space where the drawings had sat now felt conspicuously empty. "And Miranda, clear my schedule for lunch today. I need to do something." The assistant made a note, her eyebrows rising in surprise because Elise never cleared her schedule for anything that wasn't a crisis requiring immediate intervention. "May I ask what for?" Elise looked at the empty space on her desk, then at her assistant, who had served her with efficiency and discretion for 6 years and probably deserved occasional honesty. "Research," she said. "Into being a better person. I assume there are books or articles or something." Miranda's expression cycled through confusion to recognition to something that might have been hope or might have been concern. She nodded once, made another note, and retreated from the office to rearrange the day's appointments around whatever personal crisis her boss was experiencing. Elise turned to her computer and opened a browser and typed into the search bar, "How to be someone a child wants as a friend." The results were predictably useless parenting blogs and advice columns that assumed familiarity with childhood development and emotional availability that she had systematically eliminated from her skill set. She closed the browser and sat staring at her blank screen, feeling foolish and determined in equal measure. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her open the message. It was a photo of Chloe at a small desk bent over a coloring book, her tongue poking out in concentration. Below the image, "First day of being your friend. She wanted you to see she's being good." Noah, Elise stared at the photo for a long moment at this child who had somehow decided that the woman who mocked her father deserved friendship and second chances and crayon drawings with question marks. She saved the image to her phone, then typed a response that took 3 attempts to get right. "Tell her she's doing excellent work and thank you for sending this." The response came almost immediately. "She says you should come to dinner sometime. Fair warning, it's usually mac and cheese." Elise found herself smiling at her phone like a teenager receiving attention from a crush, then immediately felt ridiculous for the comparison. This wasn't a crush. This was a 7-year-old extending an invitation and her father being polite enough to relay it. Nothing more complicated than that. Except it was more complicated because Noah could have ignored his daughter's request, could have explained that CEOs didn't come to dinner at employees' apartments, could have maintained the professional boundaries that Elise herself had spent months enforcing through mockery and criticism. Instead, he was extending the invitation as if he actually believed she might accept it, as if he thought she deserved a place at his table despite everything. "I'd like that," she typed, then hesitated before adding, "When works for your schedule." The response took longer this time, long enough that Elise opened her email and tried to focus on quarterly reports while simultaneously waiting for her phone to buzz again. When it finally did, Noah's message was longer than his previous ones. "Friday night, 6:30, fair warning. My apartment is small and Chloe will probably ask you 1,000 questions about what it's like being a boss. Also, she's decided you need a nickname because Miss Whitmore is too formal for friends. She's currently workshopping options. Prepare yourself." Elise read the message 3 times, parsing it for hidden meanings or corporate politeness, masking reluctance, but found only straightforward invitation and gentle humor. She was being invited into their lives not as CEO or authority figure, but as something approaching a friend, and the prospect terrified her more than any hostile board meeting or shareholder challenge ever had. "Friday works," she replied, "and tell Chloe I look forward to hearing her nickname options, though I reserve the right to veto anything too ridiculous." She says E is her current frontrunner. Apparently it sounds like easy, which she thinks is funny. Kids are weird. "E works," Elise typed, and felt something warm and unfamiliar settle in her chest as she added, "See you Friday, both of you." She set her phone down and returned her attention to the quarterly reports that actually mattered to her job security and professional reputation. But the warmth remained stubborn and persistent, a small flame that years of practiced coldness couldn't quite extinguish. The rest of the week unfolded with strange momentum. Familiar routines disrupted by new awareness that changed nothing about the actual work, but somehow transformed her experience of it. Elise still attended meetings and reviewed budgets and made decisions that affected hundreds of employees she would never personally meet. But now she found herself noticing details she had previously dismissed: the receptionist who always arrived 10 minutes early and used the time to organize her desk with meticulous care. The junior analyst who brought his lunch in containers that suggested someone cared enough to cook for him. The IT technician who made small talk with the security guards in a way that suggested genuine interest rather than networking strategy. Noah appeared in her office twice more that week, once to deliver a report she had requested and once to ask about server maintenance scheduling that required executive approval. Both interactions remained professionally appropriate, but something had shifted in the quality of their silence. The space between words now filled with acknowledgement rather than tension. On Thursday, the board review materialized exactly as predicted. Victor Hammond armed with questions that were really accusations. other board members watching with the calculating interest of people assessing weakness and prey. They questioned her recent behavior, said about the incident with the two developers, suggested that personal feelings were compromising professional judgment. Elise sat at the head of the long conference table and answered each question with clinical precision, providing context and performance metrics that demonstrated Noah Carter's value to the company while carefully avoiding any defense that could be interpreted as emotional attachment. She acknowledged that her rebuke of the two developers had been sharp, but maintained it was appropriate given their violation of company policies regarding workplace respect. She presented data showing that flexible scheduling for parents single or otherwise improved retention and productivity. She turned every attack into an opportunity to demonstrate exactly why she remained the best person to lead Whitmore Enterprises into its next phase of growth. By the time the meeting concluded, Victor looked frustrated rather than triumphant, and the other board members seemed satisfied that no immediate crisis existed. Elise gathered her materials and left the conference room with her reputation intact and her position secure at least for another quarter. But she felt no satisfaction in the victory, only a hollow exhaustion that came from defending herself against attacks that were technically groundless but philosophically accurate. She was changing her judgment, was being influenced by personal considerations. The armor she had built was developing cracks that could eventually become structural failures. The question was whether those cracks represented damage or growth, weakness or evolution. That night alone in her apartment with expensive wine and cheap takeout, Elise pulled out her phone and looked at the photo Noah had sent of Chloe coloring. The child's concentration was absolute, her small hand gripping the crayon with determination that suggested this wasn't just entertainment, but important work. Elise found herself wondering what it felt like to care about something that much, to throw yourself into an activity with no concern for appearances or outcomes, to exist in a moment without calculating its value against future goals. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt that kind of pure engagement with anything. Maybe before her father's lesson, before James's betrayal, before she understood that authenticity was a luxury afforded only to people who didn't have enemies waiting for moments of vulnerability. Friday approached with an inevitability that felt both welcome and terrifying. Elise caught herself thinking about it during meetings, wondering what to bring to dinner at a single father's apartment, whether she should dress down from her usual executive uniform or whether that would seem like she was trying too hard. She had never been good at casual, had spent so many years perfecting corporate presentation that she wasn't sure she remembered how to be a person who simply showed up at someone's home without agenda or armor. She left the office at 5:30 early enough that Miranda actually looked startled and asked if everything was all right. Elise assured her that nothing was wrong, everything was fine, she simply had plans that required leaving at a reasonable hour for once. Miranda's expression suggested deep skepticism, but professional restraint, and Elise escaped before her assistant could ask follow-up questions that would require explanations she wasn't prepared to provide. At home, she showered and changed into dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that had cost a fortune but looked deceptively simple, a compromise between approachability and her inability to actually wear anything that came from a normal retail store. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror and stared at a version of herself she barely recognized. No power suit, no severe hairstyle, just a woman in jeans about to have dinner with people who had somehow decided she deserved their friendship, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. She arrived at Noah's building at exactly 6:29, having circled the block twice to avoid being either early or late, and found herself standing outside a converted brownstone in a neighborhood that straddled the line between working-class stability and gentrification's leading edge. The building had character but needed updating, the kind of place where plumbing was reliable, but aesthetics were secondary to functionality. Elise climbed to the third floor and knocked on apartment 3B with a hand that trembled slightly, then felt ridiculous for being nervous about dinner with a 7-year-old. The door opened immediately as if Chloe had been waiting on the other side, and the little girl beamed up at her with gap-toothed enthusiasm. You came." The nickname sounded natural in Chloe's voice, transforming from potential joke into simple fact, and Elise found herself smiling as she stepped into an apartment that was perhaps a third the size of her own and somehow infinitely warmer. The space was cluttered but clean, toys organized in bins along one wall, Furniture that looked comfortable, rather than curated walls decorated with Chloe's artwork, in frames that suggested Noah took his daughter's creative output seriously enough to display it like gallery pieces. Noah appeared from what must have been the kitchen wearing jeans and a t-shirt that revealed he had actual arm muscles beneath his usual work clothes, and offered her a smile that held no trace of the wariness she was accustomed to seeing in his expression. "Welcome," he said. Fair warning, the mac and cheese is from a box, but Chloe insisted on adding her own special touches, so there might be hot dogs cut into octopus shapes. "Special touches make it gourmet," Elise replied, surprising herself with the ease of the response, and followed them into a kitchen that could barely fit 3 people, but somehow felt exactly the right size for what was happening. Dinner was chaos and laughter and questions that came rapid fire from a child who apparently believed every adult was fascinating and deserved thorough investigation. Chloe wanted to know what Elise's favorite color was. She said blue, though she wasn't sure she'd ever actually considered the question whether she had any pets. No, her apartment didn't allow them, which was probably for the best, given her work schedule. What her favorite food was. She hesitated before admitting she genuinely enjoyed the overly fancy French restaurant near her office, and Chloe declared they should go there together sometime, because friends did that sort of thing. Noah mostly watched, occasionally interjecting to remind his daughter to chew before talking or to gently redirect when questions became too personal. But Elise found herself answering, honestly, dropping the careful corporate phrasing she usually employed in favor of responses that Chloe could actually understand. After dinner, Chloe insisted on showing Elise her room, which was barely large enough for a twin bed and a small desk, but was decorated with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested space limitations couldn't contain personality. Posters of cartoon characters covered one wall, a solar system, mobile hung from the ceiling, and more drawings covered every available surface. Some framed, others taped haphazardly, all displaying the kind of prolific creativity that came from having too many ideas to contain. "This is where I made your drawings," Chloe announced, gesturing toward her desk, where crayons and markers lived in organized chaos. "Daddy says I should always sign my art, but I forgot to on yours. So technically, they could be from anyone." Elise crouched to examine the workspace, noting the careful way everything was arranged, despite the crowding, the evidence of a child who had been taught to respect her materials, even when space was limited. "I'll know they're from you anyway," she said. "Nobody else draws crowns quite like you do." Chloe beamed at this, clearly pleased by the compliment, then suddenly wrapped her arms around Elise's waist in a hug that was entirely unprompted and utterly disarming. Elise froze, unsure how to respond to physical affection she hadn't invited and didn't know how to reciprocate. But then her arms moved of their own accord, awkward and uncertain, returning the embrace with the careful gentleness of someone handling something infinitely precious and terrifyingly fragile. When Chloe pulled back, her expression was serious in that way children sometimes became when delivering truths adults preferred to avoid. "My daddy says you're sad sometimes, but you don't let anyone see it. Is that true?" The question landed like a physical blow, stripping away years of carefully maintained presentation to reveal the truth Elise had convinced herself was invisible. She looked at this 7-year-old who somehow saw past tailored clothes and executive authority to the loneliness beneath, and felt her throat close around words that refused to form. "Yes," she finally managed. "That's true." Chloe nodded as if this was exactly the answer she expected. "That's okay. Friends help each other stop being sad. That's kind of the whole point." Then she skipped out of the room, apparently satisfied that she had solved a complex emotional equation with elementary logic, leaving Elise crouched beside a child's desk, with tears threatening to breach the disciplined control that had held them back for years. Noah appeared in the doorway, his expression gentle and knowing in a way that suggested he had heard the entire exchange. "She's not subtle," he offered. "Takes after me in that regard, apparently." Elise stood wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand in a gesture that was neither professional nor dignified, but was simply human. "Does it get easier?" she asked. Being someone who actually feels things, Noah considered this, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed in a posture that was somehow both casual and supportive. "Easier isn't really the right word. It gets realer. More complicated. Sometimes harder, actually, but also worth it in ways that the safe version never was." He pushed off from the doorframe and gestured toward the living room, where Chloe was already setting up some sort of board game that apparently required adult participation. Come on, she's going to insist we play whatever she picked out, and I promise you she makes up rules as she goes. It's chaos and you'll probably lose, but that's kind of the experience. Elise followed him out of the bedroom, leaving behind the drawings and crayons, an evidence of creativity that knew no boundaries, and settled onto a couch that was comfortable rather than stylish, while a 7-year-old explained incomprehensible game rules with the absolute confidence of someone who believed adults would simply adapt to whatever reality she constructed. And for the next 2 hours, Elise did exactly that, played games with made-up rules, laughed at jokes that weren't particularly funny, but were delivered with such enthusiasm they became hilarious, and slowly, carefully began to understand what it meant to be someone who didn't always know the right answer, but showed up anyway. When she finally left at 9, long past, when she normally would have ended any social obligation, Chloe hugged her goodbye with the same unself-conscious affection she had shown earlier, and Noah walked her to the door with an expression that suggested he understood exactly how significant this evening had been. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. It meant a lot to Chloe, to both of us actually. "Thank you for inviting me," Elise replied, and meant it more than any corporate pleasantries she had ever delivered. This was she paused, searching for words that could accurately convey what had happened in this small apartment, with its cluttered warmth and genuine connection. This was exactly what I needed. Noah smiled, small and private and somehow intimate, despite the public hallway they stood in. "You're welcome back any time, E. Consider yourself officially adopted into our chaos." The drive home felt longer than it should have. Elise's mind replaying moments from the evening to Chloe's questions, Noah's quiet support, the feeling of being welcomed into a space without conditions or expectations beyond simple human decency. She parked in her building's garage and rode the elevator to her apartment, stepping into a space that suddenly felt cavernous and cold compared to the warmth she had just left. She poured herself wine out of habit rather than desire, and stood at her window looking out over the Boston skyline at the thousands of lit windows that represented lives being lived beyond her ability to control or influence. Somewhere out there, Noah was probably putting Chloe to bed, reading her a story, or listening to her recount the highlights of having the boss lady over for dinner. Somewhere out there, people were being kind to each other without calculating the cost, were forming connections that made them vulnerable but gave them strength. Elise pulled out her phone and looked at the photo of Chloe coloring, then opened her camera and took a picture of her own reflection in the darkened window. A woman in an expensive apartment holding an expensive phone, looking more uncertain than she had in years and somehow more alive because of it. She set an alarm for earlier than usual the next morning, then did something she hadn't done in months. She climbed into bed without checking her email one final time, trusting that whatever crises had emerged during her absence could wait until she had slept and dreamed and woken into a weekend that suddenly held possibility beyond the usual reports and strategic planning. Sleep came easier than expected, and with it dreams that were gentle rather than anxious, filled with crowns made of crayon and laughter that needed no corporate justification. When morning came, Elise woke with a clarity that felt like emerging from underwater. After holding her breath so long, she had forgotten what air tasted like. She had spent years building armor to protect herself from exactly the kind of vulnerability that Noah and Chloe represented. She had convinced herself that distance was strength, that caring was weakness, that the only way to survive in a world designed to exploit emotion was to eliminate emotion entirely. But lying in bed as early light filtered through expensive curtains, Elise finally admitted what she had been fighting. Since the moment a 7-year-old extended a drawing and asked if they could be friends, she had built her armor so well that she had trapped herself inside it, had become so proficient at not feeling that she had forgotten what feelings were for. The answer to Chloe's question, could they be friends, was yes. But answering yes meant accepting that friendship required vulnerability, required showing up as someone real rather than someone performing competence. It meant risking the kind of hurt that came from caring about people who could leave, could disappoint, could discover that the person beneath the title wasn't worth knowing after all. It was terrifying. It was necessary. It was perhaps what she had been searching for in every hostile board meeting and aggressive acquisition, every night spent alone in an apartment designed to impress people who never visited evidence that she was more than the cruelty her father had taught her to weaponize, more than the lessons learned from a man who paid someone to betray her and called it education. Elise got out of bed and began her morning routine, but something had fundamentally shifted. The person who moved through expensive rooms and prepared for another day of corporate warfare was still the CEO, still capable of the decisiveness and strategic thinking that her position required. But now she was also someone who had played board games with made-up rules, who had been hugged by a 7-year-old, who thought friendship was simple, who had been invited to belong somewhere without first proving she deserved the invitation. The weekend stretched ahead with its usual empty hours, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elise found herself looking forward to Monday morning, not because she needed the structure of work to avoid examining her life, but because she wanted to see Noah and Chloe again, wanted to continue this strange experiment of being someone who allowed herself to care about people beyond their utility to her professional goals. She spent Saturday researching child-appropriate activities in Boston, bookmarking museums and parks and events that might interest a 7-year-old with unlimited questions and an enthusiasm for learning. She went to a bookstore, an actual physical bookstore, not an online algorithm, and asked the staff for recommendations about books that helped adults understand children about navigating friendship when you had spent years pretending you didn't need it. Sunday brought the usual preparation for the coming week, but Elise found herself working through emails faster than normal, clearing space in her schedule for things that weren't strictly business critical, but felt essential to the person she was tentatively becoming. She approved budget increases for the employee childcare subsidy program, something she had previously dismissed as unnecessary expense. She drafted a memo about workplace culture and professional boundaries that acknowledged the difference between appropriate criticism and personal cruelty. Small changes, incremental adjustments to patterns she had followed for years, but they represented something larger, a willingness to consider that the way she had been doing things wasn't the only way and possibly wasn't even the best way. When Monday morning arrived, Elise dressed in her usual armor, but felt different inside it, as if the silk and tailoring no longer defined her, but simply clothed someone more complex than executive authority could fully contain. She drove to the office with her coffee and her prepared remarks for the day's meetings, and when she walked through the lobby at 7:47, she found herself looking for Noah and Chloe, with an anticipation that had nothing to do with maintaining her mockery routine and everything to do with genuine curiosity about how their weekend had gone. They appeared at 7:52, right on schedule, and when Chloe saw her, she broke free from her father's hand and ran across the marble floor with the kind of joyful abandon that the space wasn't designed for, her backpack bouncing against her spine with each step. We had pancakes this morning, and I told Daddy we should have invited you, but he said you probably had your own breakfast plans, which is fair because you're an important person who is very busy. The words tumbled out in a breathless rush, and Elise found herself crouching down, again ruining the lines of her skirt, but not particularly caring, because Chloe's enthusiasm deserved engagement at eye level. Next time she said, "If your daddy makes pancakes again, I'd like to be invited." Really, Chloe's eyes went wide. Because they're really good. He makes faces with chocolate chips and everything. Really, Elise confirmed, and looked up to find Noah watching them with an expression that held something warm and complicated and possibly hopeful. They stood in the lobby like that for a moment, CEO crouched before an excited 7-year-old single father, watching his daughter interact with the woman who had spent months making his professional life difficult, and Elise felt the strange certainty that this was a beginning, rather than an ending, that whatever came next would be messy and complicated and absolutely worth the vulnerability it required. Around them, the office continued its Monday morning ritual, employees flowing past with coffee and deadlines and the careful navigation of corporate hierarchies. But in this small pocket of marble floor, something different was happening. Friendship without conditions, connection without calculation. Three people figuring out how to be human together in a space designed for business rather than belonging. Elise stood her knees protesting the movement and offered Chloe a smile that felt genuine rather than tactical. "Have a good day at school," she said. "And remember, friends tell each other about their adventures. So next time I see you, I want to hear all about what happened today." Chloe nodded seriously as if accepting an important mission, then grabbed her father's hand and headed toward the elevators, while Elise watched them go with something warm settling permanently in her chest. The day progressed with its usual demands, but Elise found herself handling them differently, still decisive, still strategic, but with an awareness that every decision affected actual people with actual lives that extended beyond quarterly projections. When she reviewed the layoff proposal that had been sitting on her desk for weeks, she didn't reject it entirely but demanded more specific information about retention options, about whether transfers were possible, about what resources existed to help people transition if cuts proved necessary. When Miranda brought her lunch, Elise actually thanked her by name and asked about her weekend, and her assistant looked so startled by the personal question that Elise made a mental note to examine exactly what kind of boss she had been. That common courtesy registered as surprising. At 3, a commotion outside her office drew her attention. Through the glass walls, she could see a small crowd gathering near the break room, voices raised in what sounded like celebration or possibly alarm. Elise stood and walked toward the noise, her heels clicking against marble as she moved through the curious employees who parted to let her pass. In the break room, Noah stood near the counter with Chloe, and the child was holding a paper that she kept waving at her father while practically vibrating with excitement. "But Daddy, it's an A+. Mrs. Henderson said, "My handwriting is improving and everything." Noah was laughing, that warm, genuine sound that Elise had heard Friday night, and he scooped his daughter into a hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "I'm so proud of you, Chloe Bear. You worked really hard on that assignment." "I know. And that's why we should celebrate. And E should celebrate with us because she's our friend, and friends celebrate together." The logic was flawless, and Elise found herself speaking before consciously deciding to intervene in this moment. "What are we celebrating?" All faces turned toward her, the other employees looking various degrees of startled that the CEO had appeared during what was clearly a personal family moment. But Chloe just beamed and held up her paper for Elise to see. "I got an A+ on my creative writing assignment. We had to write about someone we admire, and I wrote about you and Daddy." Elise accepted the paper with hands that weren't quite steady, scanning the large, uneven print that described a boss lady who wore crowns and a daddy who made the best pancakes, and how together they were teaching her about being brave and kind at the same time. The writing was charming in its simplicity, honest in ways that professional communication never achieved, and completely devastating in its assumption that Elise deserved to be admired at all. "This is wonderful, Chloe," she managed, her voice rougher than intended. "Your teacher was right, your handwriting is getting much better. And you don't even have to try to read it." Chloe's enthusiasm knew no limits. "Usually adults have to squint and ask what words are, but you just read it straight through, which means I'm really improving." The gathered employees were still watching, though some had begun to drift away once they realized no actual crisis was occurring. But Elise caught whispers, saw glances exchanged that suggested this moment would join the office gossip circulation with speed and speculation she couldn't control. She didn't particularly care. "This deserves proper celebration," she announced, still holding the paper like it was a document of actual importance. "Ice cream sounds appropriate for an A+. Really?" Chloe bounced on her toes. Right now," Elise confirmed and looked at Noah with a question in her expression that she hoped he could decipher. "Is this okay? Am I overstepping? Am I doing this friendship thing correctly?" Noah's smile suggested she was doing just fine, and he pulled out his phone to check his schedule. "I can probably shift my 4 o'clock. There's a place 2 blocks from here that Chloe's been wanting to try." "Then it's settled," Elise said, and felt something in her chest expand at the realization that she had just made a spontaneous, personal decision during work hours, something the old version of herself would have dismissed as frivolous and inappropriate. They left the office together, 3 people walking through the marble lobby, past curious receptionists, and into the October afternoon where fall leaves tumbled across sidewalks, and the air carried just enough chill to require light jackets. Chloe held both their hands literally between her father and her new friend E, chattering about her teacher and her assignment and how she had been nervous about whether her writing was good enough. But then Mrs. Henderson had drawn a smiley face at the top, which meant it was definitely good. The ice cream shop was small and crowded with after-school families, parents navigating strollers, and teenagers claiming tables in groups that excluded anyone over 16. They ordered at the counter, Chloe getting something with impossible amounts of toppings, Noah choosing plain vanilla in a way that suggested either simplicity or budget consciousness, Elise requesting pistachio, and then wondering when she had last eaten ice cream at all. They found a table near the window, cramped and slightly sticky, and Chloe immediately launched into a detailed explanation of exactly what made her assignment A+ worthy, according to Mrs. Henderson's grading rubric. Elise listened with attention that surprised her, genuinely interested, in the 7-year-old's academic achievement in ways she couldn't quite explain. When Chloe paused to attack her ice cream with enthusiasm that suggested architectural stability was secondary to consumption, Noah leaned back in his chair and studied Elise with an expression she was learning to recognize. Assessment mixed with something that might have been approval. "You're good at this," he offered quietly. "Being her friend, she doesn't warm up to everyone this quickly." "I don't have much practice," Elise admitted. "The last time I had friends was probably college, and even then I think they were more networking contacts than actual relationships." "Well, you're doing fine now. Better than fine, actually." The compliment landed warmer than it should have, and Elise found herself looking away toward the window, where October's sunlight painted everything gold, buying herself time to gather composure that kept slipping away in moments like this. When they finished their ice cream, and Chloe had sufficiently documented the experience with observations that would probably appear in future creative writing assignments, they walked back toward the office building where Noah's car was parked. Chloe skipped ahead, still energized by sugar and achievement, while the adults followed at a more measured pace. "Thank you for this," Noah said, "for celebrating with her. It matters more than you probably realize." "It matters to me too," Elise replied, surprising herself with the honesty. "I can't remember the last time I did something spontaneous just because it seemed like the right thing to do. Maybe that's the point. Maybe we're all just figuring it out as we go, doing our best with what we know and hoping it's enough." They reached the office building and paused outside while Chloe ran ahead to look at the lobby fountain she passed every morning, but apparently never tired of examining. Noah checked his watch, clearly calculating how much time remained before his rescheduled meeting required his attention. "I should get her home," he said. "Mrs. Patterson is expecting us, and I've got that 4 o'clock I need to attend remotely." "Of course," Elise replied, feeling suddenly awkward about how much time she had just taken from both their days for something as simple as ice cream. "I hope I didn't disrupt your schedule too much." Noah looked at her for a long moment, his expression serious in a way that suggested he was about to say something important. "Elise, spontaneous ice cream with my daughter is never a disruption. It's exactly the kind of thing I hope she remembers when she's older and thinks about her childhood. So thank you for being part of that." The words hit her somewhere vulnerable, and she nodded because speaking might reveal exactly how much the statement meant to her. Noah called to Chloe, who came running back full of observations about fountain water patterns, and they said their goodbyes with Chloe hugging Elise one more time before heading toward the parking garage. Elise stood outside her own building, watching them disappear around the corner, feeling the lingering warmth of connection mixed with uncertainty about what came next. She had crossed lines today, personal time during work hours, spontaneous decisions, emotional availability that her father would have identified as weakness requiring immediate correction. But as she rode the elevator back to her office and settled behind her desk, where Miranda had left messages requiring attention and decisions demanding action, Elise found she didn't regret any of it. The afternoon's abandonment of her usual schedule felt less like failure and more like progress toward becoming someone who could be both CEO and human, both authority figure and friend. She pulled Chloe's creative writing assignment from her briefcase, where she had carefully stored it, and read through the assignment again, this time noting details she had missed in the break room chaos. The little girl had described Elise as someone who wore crowns and made important decisions, and was learning to smile more, which meant Chloe had been observing her longer than Elise realized, tracking changes that Elise herself had only recently begun to acknowledge. The day concluded with its usual demands: emails, answered reports, reviewed strategic decisions made that would ripple through departments in ways both visible and hidden. But when Elise finally left the office at 7 later than intended, but earlier than typical, she drove home with something that felt dangerously close to contentment. Her apartment waited with its expensive emptiness, but tonight the silence felt less oppressive and more restful space for reflection rather than evidence of isolation. She changed into comfortable clothes and made herself dinner from actual ingredients, rather than takeout containers, and sat at her kitchen counter with Chloe's assignment spread beside her plate, like reading material that mattered. Friends celebrate together, the little girl had declared with absolute certainty, as if friendship was just that simple: showing up, paying attention, choosing to care even when it complicated your carefully controlled schedule. And maybe it was that simple, Elise thought. Maybe she had spent years overthinking connection because accepting its simplicity would have required admitting how badly she wanted it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Noah. Chloe wanted me to tell you she had the best day. Also, we're having a movie night Friday if you want to join. Your nickname has been upgraded to Best Friend E, so you're clearly making an impression. Elise smiled at her, phone typed, I'll be there, and felt the last remnants of her afternoon uncertainty dissolve into anticipation for Friday evening and whatever chaos a 7-year-old's movie night entailed. The server crash happened on a Tuesday night at 11:47, precisely the kind of inconvenient timing that suggested the universe had a sense of humor about human planning. Elise was already in bed halfway through a book she wasn't really reading when her phone lit up with the emergency alert that meant critical systems were compromised and her presence was required immediately, regardless of hour or circumstance. She dressed in the dark, pulling on jeans and a sweater that felt wrong after weeks of executive armor, and drove through empty Boston streets where traffic lights blinked yellow for audiences that didn't exist. The city at midnight was a different creature entirely. All shadows and possibility. The daytime's aggressive hustle replaced by something quieter and more honest. The lobby security guard waved her through with sympathy that suggested he'd seen this drill before executives summoned from sleep to manage disasters that couldn't wait until morning. Emergency lighting cast everything in harsh angles, transforming familiar marble into alien landscape. Elise's footsteps echoed too loudly as she headed for the server room, expecting to find the overnight IT staff frantically troubleshooting whatever had triggered the cascade failure. Instead, she found Noah. He stood amid the blinking equipment racks, his hair disheveled in ways that suggested he'd been running his hands through it, his t-shirt and jeans, making him look younger than his daylight professional persona. He glanced up when she entered, surprise flickering across his tired face before settling into something like resignation. You're here, server emergency, Elise replied, gesturing at the chaos of error messages scrolling across multiple monitors. Same reason as you, I assume. I was finishing a presentation for tomorrow's board meeting. She paused, taking in the scope of the alerts. Though I suppose none of that matters if the entire financial database is corrupted. Noah nodded and returned his attention to the terminal, his fingers moving across the keyboard, with practiced efficiency that spoke of years handling systems that other people broke. Elise found herself watching him work, noting the way he moved through diagnostic protocols without hesitation, the confidence that came from genuine expertise rather than performed competence. An hour passed in focused silence, both of them absorbed in different aspects of the crisis. Noah working through code and server logs, while Elise coordinated with the cloud backup team via laptop, ensuring that whatever data they couldn't immediately recover wouldn't be permanently lost. The server room's cooling system hummed around them, maintaining temperature for equipment that generated heat equivalent to small furnaces. Around 1 in the morning, Elise noticed Noah's hands beginning to shake as he typed subtle tremors that suggested his body was running on fumes and determination. He reached for the cold coffee sitting beside his keyboard, grimaced at the taste, and set it back down without drinking more than a sip. When did you last eat? The question emerged before she could consider whether it was appropriate, whether crossing into personal concern violated the professional boundaries they had been carefully reconstructing. Noah looked up, clearly surprised by the inquiry. I don't remember. Lunch, maybe I was planning to grab dinner after finishing the presentation, but then this happened. Elise stood without responding and left the server room, navigating the darkened executive floor to the private lounge where fully stocked refrigerators existed to service late-night meetings and overtime sessions. She assembled a sandwich from ingredients that cost more per pound than seemed reasonable, grabbed water bottles and energy bars, and returned to find Noah exactly where she'd left him, though his hands were now pressed against his eyes in a gesture that suggested either exhaustion or despair. She set the food beside him without ceremony. Eat, you're no use to anyone if you collapse. He stared at the sandwich, then at her, and something vulnerable passed across his face before gratitude replaced it. Thank you. Elise returned to her laptop, refusing to watch him eat, because that felt too intimate for the space they occupied. But she heard him unwrap the sandwich, heard the quiet sounds of someone remembering they had a body with needs beyond professional obligations. The silence between them shifted, becoming less about focused work and more about shared exhaustion. Two people existing in the same space without requiring performance. Another hour disappeared into troubleshooting and recovery protocols. The crisis was manageable rather than catastrophic, a storage array failure that had triggered cascading errors, but hadn't actually corrupted critical data. They would need to rebuild some indexes, restore from backups in places, but the company wouldn't wake to financial chaos or security breaches that made headlines. Around 2:30, Elise felt her own concentration fragmenting her vision, blurring at the edges in ways that suggested her body was staging a rebellion against the hours she routinely demanded from it. She reached for her coffee cup and nearly knocked it over, her coordination compromised by lack of sleep and the particular exhaustion that came from maintaining constant vigilance. "Are you okay?" Noah's voice came from across the server room, closer than she expected, and she realized he had moved from his terminal to stand near her workstation. "Fine," she replied automatically, the word emerging clipped and defensive because admitting weakness wasn't something she had trained herself to do. "You don't look fine." She spun toward him, ready to deliver one of her characteristic cutting remarks that would reestablish distance and professional hierarchy. But something in his expression stopped her genuine concern, devoid of judgment, the kind of care that asked questions without demanding answers. "I haven't slept in 3 days." The admission escaped before she could contain it. "The board has been questioning my leadership. There are rumors about a hostile takeover, and I—" She stopped, pressing fingertips to her temple where a headache was building, with the slow inevitability of weather systems. The server room suddenly felt too small, the air too thin, as if all the oxygen was being consumed by equipment that didn't need to breathe. "I'm fine." But even as she said it, the room tilted slightly, her equilibrium disrupted by exhaustion and stress and the accumulated weight of maintaining perfection for an audience that was never satisfied. She felt herself sway, her balance giving way, and then Noah's hands caught her arms, steadying her against his chest with a care that felt simultaneously necessary and dangerous. They both froze. He was close enough that she could smell him soap and coffee and something warm that might have been his natural scent, or might have been her oxygen-deprived brain inventing intimacy where none existed. Close enough to see gold flecks in his brown eyes that she had never noticed during their daylight encounters. Close enough that she could feel his heartbeat through his shirt, steady and strong, while hers raced with something that absolutely was not attraction, because that would complicate everything in ways she couldn't afford. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the apology encompassing more than this moment of weakness. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay." His voice was quiet, almost gentle, and his hands remained on her arms, holding her steady, but not constraining, offering support without demanding anything in return. They stood like that for a beat too long, neither willing to break contact. First, the server room's ambient noise fading to background static, while something unspoken passed between them. Elise became acutely aware of every point where their bodies connected, his hands on her arms, her shoulder against his chest, the warmth that seemed to radiate from him despite the room's aggressive air conditioning. Then she pulled back, her cheeks flushing in ways that had nothing to do with server room temperatures, and gathered her laptop and notes with movements that felt clumsy and uncertain. "I should go." Her words came rushed, anxious to escape before this moment could be examined too closely. "The system's stable now. You should get some rest too." Noah nodded, stepping back to give her space, but his expression held something new. Understanding mixed with curiosity, as if he had discovered a truth about her that changed his calculations. She fled toward the door, desperate for air and distance, and the safety of her car, where she could process what had just happened without his witness. At the threshold, she paused, her hand on the frame, unable to leave without acknowledging what he had done tonight. Noah. He looked up from where he had returned to his terminal, already back to work, despite the hour and the exhaustion. "Thank you. For tonight. For everything." Then she was gone, her footsteps echoing through empty corridors as she fled toward the elevator and the parking garage, and the solitude where she could safely examine the feeling that had settled in her chest when he caught her, something warm and terrifying and absolutely forbidden, given the power dynamics that made any attraction between them impossible. The drive home was a blur of street lights and empty roads, Elise's mind replaying the moment in the server room with obsessive detail. His hands on her arms, the gold flecks in his eyes. The way her heart had accelerated in ways that had nothing to do with nearly falling, and everything to do with proximity to someone who saw her as human rather than authority figure. She was falling for him. The realization hit somewhere between the office and her apartment, arriving with the inevitability of sunrise after a sleepless night. She was falling for Noah Carter, the single father she had mocked for months, the competent engineer who somehow managed work and parenting with grace. She couldn't comprehend the man whose daughter had decided Elise deserved friendship, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It was the worst possible complication. It was also, she suspected as she parked and rode the elevator to her empty apartment, completely inevitable from the moment Chloe had handed her that first drawing and asked if they could be friends. Wednesday arrived with cruel punctuality, dragging Elise from troubled sleep into a day that demanded performance she wasn't certain she could deliver. The board meeting loomed at Victor Hammond's presence, guaranteed to transform routine updates into warfare. She dressed with extra care armor, selected for battle, every detail calculated to project unshakable confidence, even as doubt gnawed at her composure. The morning passed in a haze of preparation, reviewing financial reports, memorizing talking points, anticipating every angle of attack Victor might employ. Miranda brought coffee and concern in equal measure, clearly sensing her boss's unusual tension, but professional enough to ask no questions. At 1:45, Elise gathered her materials and walked toward the executive conference room where the board was already assembling. She paused outside the glass doors, watching through windows as members took their seats. Some allies, some neutral observers, and Victor Hammond holding court at the far end of the table like a king, awaiting the opportunity to pronounce judgment. She entered with her head high and her expression neutral, taking her position at the table's head, while making brief eye contact with each board member in turn, establishing dominance through simple acknowledgement. The meeting commenced with routine business quarterly reports and budget approvals that passed without significant debate. Then Victor cleared his throat. Before we adjourn, I'd like to address concerns that have been brought to my attention regarding recent leadership decisions. Elise felt her spine straighten, every nerve suddenly alert to danger. Around the table, board members shifted in their seats, some looking uncomfortable, others leaning forward with interest that suggested they had been expecting this confrontation. "The floor is yours, Victor," Elise replied, her voice level despite adrenaline flooding her system. "Several shareholders have expressed concern about your recent behavior. The incident with the developers last week, the time you've been spending with subordinate staff members, rumors about personal relationships compromising professional judgment." He paused, letting the implications settle like poison in water. "Let's be honest here. The numbers are solid, but leadership requires more than quarterly performance. It requires stability, discretion, and the ability to maintain appropriate boundaries. Whitmore Enterprises needs a CEO who won't let personal feelings interfere with business decisions." The room went silent, every person present understanding they were witnessing something significant. Elise felt her throat tighten, familiar patterns activating, the expectation that she would absorb criticism without defense, would apologize for showing. Humanity would sacrifice personal connection to preserve professional credibility. But before she could formulate a response, someone else spoke. "With respect, Mr. Hammond, that's out of line." Every head turned toward the back of the room where Noah stood near the presentation equipment, present to handle technical requirements, but apparently unwilling to remain silent during what amounted to a character assassination. His face was calm, but his voice carried an edge that commanded attention from people accustomed to dismissing anyone below executive rank. Victor's face reddened, his expression cycling through surprise to indignation. "And who exactly are you? Someone who actually looks at the data instead of making assumptions based on gossip." Noah stepped forward, his posture relaxed but his presence undeniable. "Miss Whitmore has increased company revenue by 32% over 3 years. She navigated 2 market downturns and expanded into sectors that competitors didn't even recognize as opportunities. She works 80-hour weeks and makes decisions that most of this board couldn't handle if given a month to deliberate." He paused, meeting Victor's glare without flinching. "If defending an employee from workplace harassment is grounds for questioning leadership, then your concern isn't actually about stability. It's about maintaining a corporate culture where cruelty is mistaken for strength and basic human decency is treated as weakness." The silence that followed was absolute. Elise stared at Noah, her expression frozen somewhere between shock and something else she couldn't identify, while Victor's face progressed from red to purple. Board members exchanged glances that ranged from approval to concern, the power dynamics in the room shifting in ways that wouldn't be fully understood until later. "This is highly inappropriate," Victor managed finally, his voice tight with barely contained fury. A subordinate interrupting board proceedings to defend his boss raises its own questions about professional boundaries. Noah shrugged a gesture that somehow contained more confidence than Victor's entire carefully constructed authority. Then ask those questions, but do it based on actual performance metrics instead of speculation about whether the CEO smiles at the right people. He gathered his tablet and left without waiting for dismissal, the conference room door closing behind him with a finality that suggested the conversation was over, regardless of what Victor wanted. Elise sat motionless at the table's head, her heart pounding with something that combined gratitude and terror in equal measure. Victor turned his attention back to her, clearly intending to continue his attack, but another board member spoke first. Margaret Shen, a venture capitalist who had been neutral during previous conflicts, but apparently found her voice. I think we've strayed from productive discussion. Unless anyone has specific concerns about Miss Whitmore's performance rather than her interpersonal style, I suggest we table this conversation and return to actual business. Murmured agreement rippled around the table, and Victor's attempted coup dissolved without the dramatic confrontation he had clearly choreographed. The meeting concluded shortly after members filing out with whispered conversations that would fuel office speculation for weeks. Elise remained in her seat after the room emptied, staring at nothing while processing what had just happened. Noah had defended her, actually stood up in a board meeting and challenged Victor Hammond on her behalf, risking his own position to contradict a man who could make his professional life extremely difficult with a few phone calls. She found him on the rooftop terrace, standing near the railing with his hands in his pockets, looking out over Boston's skyline like a tourist contemplating postcards. He turned when he heard her approach, his expression shifting from contemplative to carefully neutral. That was reckless, Elise said without preamble. Victor has connections across the industry. He could make things very difficult for you. I know. Noah's voice was quiet but steady. I did it anyway. Why? The question hung between them, weighted with everything they hadn't said during late nights in server rooms, in spontaneous ice cream celebrations, and the careful rebuilding of a dynamic that had started with mockery and somehow transformed into something neither of them knew how to name. Because you shouldn't have to fight alone, Noah replied. Because watching powerful men attack you for showing basic human decency made me angry enough to forget about self-preservation. Because someone needed to say it, and apparently I decided that someone should be me. Elise felt her carefully maintained composure cracking walls she had spent years reinforcing, suddenly feeling less like protection and more like prison. She moved to stand beside him at the railing, their shoulders nearly touching close enough to feel heat from his body in the October chill. I need to tell you something. Her voice came out rougher than intended, each word requiring effort to push past defenses that screamed warnings about vulnerability. And I need you not to interrupt until I'm finished. Noah nodded, his attention focused entirely on her in ways that made her want to both continue and retreat. When I was 24, I fell in love with a man named James. He was a carpenter, built furniture with his hands, didn't have a college degree or trust fund or any of the things my father considered essential for someone dating his daughter. But he was genuine in ways I had never experienced. He listened when I talked about wanting to do something meaningful with my life beyond inheriting a company. He made me believe that maybe I could be more than my father's carefully groomed successor. She paused, gathering courage to continue into territory she had avoided excavating for a decade. We were together for 2 years. I thought he was going to propose. Instead, I discovered he had been feeding information to my father's business rivals, stock tips, strategic plans, anything he could access through me. Confidential information that could have destroyed the company if used correctly. Noah said nothing, but she felt him tense beside her, his silence offering space for her to continue at her own pace. My father paid him to do it. Elisa's voice dropped to something hollow. Paid him a substantial amount to date me, to get close to test whether I could be trusted with real responsibility. When I confronted James, he didn't deny it. Just said the money was too good to refuse, that my father had offered him more than he'd make in 5 years of actual carpentry work. He apologized for it feeling personal, like that somehow made the betrayal less complete. The words tasted bitter, ancient poison that hadn't lost potency through years of attempted suppression. My father told me it was a lesson, that love makes you vulnerable and vulnerability makes you useless in business. He said I should be grateful he exposed James before I made the mistake of marrying someone who saw me as an opportunity rather than a person. She finally turned to look at Noah directly. So I learned the lesson. I stopped trusting people. I stopped letting anyone close enough to hurt me. I built walls so high that nothing could get through. Her throat closed around the next admission, but she forced it out anyway. And then you showed up with your worn wallet and your daughter's unconditional love and your refusal to be intimidated by my cruelty. You represented everything I had trained myself not to believe in: genuine kindness, real integrity, the possibility that caring about people didn't automatically make you weak. I didn't know what to do with that. She looked back at the skyline, unable to maintain eye contact while confessing the most dangerous truth. It reminded me of everything I gave up, everything I convinced myself didn't really exist. Watching you with Chloe, seeing how you've built a life around protecting her while managing your own struggles, it made me question whether the lessons I learned were actually wisdom or just fear disguised as strategy. Silence settled between them, heavy with confession, and the afternoon sun that painted everything in golds that suggested both endings and beginnings. Elise waited for Noah to respond, to offer comfort or critique, or simply acknowledgement that he had heard her story and understood what it cost to tell. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle enough to hurt. Your father was wrong, not about betrayal existing or people being capable of cruelty, but about love being weakness. What he taught you was survival, not strength. There's a difference, Amishu. He shifted to face her more fully, and she found herself meeting his eyes despite wanting to hide from whatever truth he was about to deliver. Real strength is what you've been doing these past weeks, letting Chloe in even though it terrified you, defending me when you could have maintained distance, showing up for ice cream celebration when you had 1,000 professional reasons to stay away. That's courage, Elise. The other thing, the walls and the isolation and the refusal to connect, that's just protection that outlived its usefulness. The words landed with precision that suggested he understood exactly what she needed to hear, and Elise felt tears gathering despite her best efforts to maintain control. She turned away before they could fall, gripping the railing hard enough that her knuckles went white. I don't know how to do this. Her confession emerged barely above a whisper. I don't know how to be someone who feels things without letting fear make all my decisions. Noah's hand covered hers on the railing, warm and solid, and offering connection without demanding anything in return. Nobody does. We're all just making it up as we go, trying to do better than the lessons we were taught. Some days are easier than others, but you don't have to figure it out alone. She looked at their hands, his covering hers, both gripping metal, that overlooked a city full of people navigating their own complicated attempts at being human, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what strength actually meant. Perhaps it wasn't about perfection or invulnerability. Perhaps it was simply about choosing to show up anyway, knowing you might fail, trusting that the attempt mattered more than the outcome. Thank you, she managed finally, for listening, for defending me today, for not letting me use cruelty as distance forever. Noah squeezed her hand once before releasing it, restoring appropriate space between them, even as something had permanently changed in the quality of their connection. You're welcome. Though fair warning, Chloe's going to be insufferable when she finds out I stood up to a board member on your behalf. She'll probably write another essay about it. Despite everything, the confession and the vulnerability and the tears still threatening, Elise laughed, the sound surprising them both with its genuine warmth. They stood on the rooftop while the afternoon stretched into early evening. Two people who had started as adversaries slowly becoming something else. Something that didn't have neat corporate labels, but felt more real than any professional relationship Elise had carefully cultivated. The following days brought subtle changes that accumulated into transformation. Elise found herself smiling more during meetings, her responses less cutting, her feedback constructive rather than cruel. She approved budget increases for employee wellness programs and childcare subsidies. She learned names of people who had worked for her for years, but existed below the level where she typically directed attention. And Chloe kept creating. The drawings appeared regularly, now taped to Elise's office door by small hands that arrived early with her father left on her desk, by a child who had somehow gained access through friendly security guards charmed by gap-toothed grins. Each drawing showed evolution stick figures becoming more detailed, crowns acquiring jewels, scenes expanding to include not just the three of them, but entire worlds of imagination that Chloe wanted to share. Friday night's movie event materialized as promised, Elise arriving at Noah's apartment with popcorn purchased from a specialty shop because she didn't know what kind children preferred and decided variety was safer than guessing wrong. Chloe answered the door wearing pajamas decorated with cartoon animals and immediately pulled Elise inside to show her the elaborate blanket fort constructed in the living room. "We're watching inside the fort," Chloe explained with the seriousness of someone describing complex architecture, "because that's how you have real movie nights. Daddy said we could make it special since you're here." They settled into the fort's cramped interior blankets, draped over furniture, creating a cave lit by string lights that Chloe had positioned with artistic intent. The movie was animated something about talking animals on an adventure that Elise would have dismissed as childish under normal circumstances, but found herself enjoying through the lens of Chloe's enthusiastic commentary. Halfway through, the little girl fell asleep against Elise's shoulder, her breathing evening into the particular rhythm that indicated complete trust and exhaustion. Elise froze, uncertain whether moving would wake her, unwilling to disturb the weight of this small person who had decided she was safe enough to sleep against. Noah glanced over from his position on Chloe's other side, his expression soft in the string light's gentle illumination. "She really loves you," he said quietly. In case that wasn't obvious from the constant drawings in the essays and the way she talks about you to anyone who will listen. The statement landed heavier than intended, and Elise found herself blinking back tears for the second time that week. This time not from pain, but from the overwhelming realization that she loved this child back, loved her fierce curiosity and unconditional kindness, and complete faith that adults could be good if you just gave them enough chances. "I love her too," Elise whispered, the confession emerging easier than expected, because it was simply true, requiring no elaborate defense or strategic consideration. "She's changed everything for me." Noah was quiet for a moment, then spoke words that would replay in Elise's mind for days afterward. "She's not the only one." Their eyes met across Chloe's sleeping form, and Elise felt her breath catch at what she saw in his expression. Recognition of something neither of them had named, but both understood was growing between them. Attraction mixed with genuine respect, possibility, complicated by every professional boundary, and power dynamic that should have made anything beyond friendship impossible. The movie continued playing, neither of them paying attention anymore, both acutely aware of the small person sleeping between them and the larger questions hovering unspoken about what they were becoming to each other. When the credits rolled, Noah carefully gathered his daughter and carried her to bed, while Elise waited in the living room, suddenly uncertain whether she should leave or stay, whether acknowledging what had just passed between them would help or complicate the careful balance they had been building. Noah returned and began folding blankets, and Elise moved to help with movements that felt domestic and comfortable in ways she hadn't experienced since college roommates and shared spaces where cleaning was communal rather than hired. They worked in silence, dismantling the fort and restoring furniture to functional arrangement, and when they finished, Noah walked her to the door with something that felt like reluctance. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said, "and for letting Chloe use you as a pillow. She'll be thrilled when she wakes up and realizes she fell asleep during the movie like a little kid." "She is a little kid," Elise replied, smiling despite the strange tension building in her chest. "And I wouldn't have missed this for anything." They stood in the doorway close enough that she could see exhaustion in his eyes despite the early hour, the particular fatigue that came from constant vigilance over another person's well-being. Without thinking, she reached up and touched his cheek, brief contact that was more gesture than actual caress, but felt significant nonetheless. "Take care of yourself too," she said quietly. "You deserve rest just as much as she does." Then she left before he could respond, before the moment could transform into something they weren't ready to navigate, her hand tingling from contact with his skin as she descended stairs and emerged into October evening that tasted like possibility and danger in equal measure. The weekend passed in a blur of work she couldn't concentrate on and thoughts she couldn't quiet. By Monday morning, Elise felt simultaneously energized and terrified, aware that something fundamental had shifted, but uncertain what came next. She dressed with particular care armor, selected not for battle but for confidence, and arrived at the office to find the lobby already buzzing with morning activity. Noah and Chloe appeared at their usual time, and this time when Elise approached them, she didn't crouch or offer formal greetings. She simply pulled a small wrapped package from her bag and handed it to Chloe with a smile. I saw this and thought you might like it. Chloe tore through wrapping paper with enthusiastic disregard for preservation, revealing a sketchbook with blank pages and a set of professional colored pencils, not the cheap waxy ones from drugstores, but actual artist-grade supplies that treated creativity with respect it deserved. For your drawings, Elise explained, so you have proper tools for all those ideas. The little girl stared at the supplies with wonder approaching reverence, then launched herself at Elise in a hug that knocked her slightly off balance. Over Chloe's shoulder, Elise met Noah's eyes and saw something there that made her heart accelerate, gratitude mixed with affection, understanding that this gift represented more than simple generosity. Thank you, Chloe breathed against her shoulder. This is the best present ever. You're welcome, sweetheart, Elise replied, and felt the endearment emerge naturally rather than forced evidence that she was becoming someone capable of casual affection without calculating its cost. They separated and Chloe immediately began planning her first drawing in her new sketchbook, while Noah gave Elise a look that promised later conversation about generosity and spoiling children and whether professional boundaries existed anymore. But beneath the mock concern, she saw warmth that suggested he wasn't actually worried, just moved by watching his daughter receive kindness from someone who had spent months not knowing how to offer it. The morning progressed with meetings and decisions that felt less burdensome now that she carried memory of Chloe's delighted reaction, evidence that small gestures could create disproportionate joy. At lunch, Miranda appeared with news that immediately soured her mood. Victor Hammond called again. He wants another meeting, says he has concerns that require immediate discussion and won't wait for the next scheduled board review. Of course he did. Victor clearly wasn't finished with whatever campaign he had begun, and Elise felt familiar defensive patterns activating walls, rising armor, reinforcing, preparing for battle against someone who viewed her humanity as weakness, requiring exploitation. But this time, as she prepared talking points and assembled performance metrics to justify her continued leadership, Elise found herself thinking about rooftop confessions and server room moments, about a 7-year-old who thought friendship was simple, and a single father who defended her to powerful men despite personal risk. She thought about the person she had been transforming into over recent weeks, and realized that going back to pure, calculated ruthlessness would require abandoning progress she wasn't willing to sacrifice. So when Victor's meeting materialized 2 days later, Elise entered the executive conference room with different energy, still professional, still prepared with data and reasoned arguments, but no longer pretending she didn't care about the people whose lives intersected with hers. Victor sat at the table with his usual predatory confidence, clearly expecting to continue the intimidation campaign he had begun in the previous board meeting. But before he could launch his opening attack, the conference room door opened and Noah entered carrying the tablet he used for presentations, his presence unexpected and immediately shifting the room's dynamic. I asked Mr. Carter to join us, Elise explained calmly. Since some of your concerns apparently relate to my interactions with staff members, it seemed appropriate to have actual staff perspective rather than speculation. Victor's face darkened, but he couldn't object without revealing that his concerns were never actually about professional conduct and always about finding leverage to undermine her position. The meeting proceeded with Noah present, and every time Victor attempted to frame Elise's recent behavioral changes as weakness or poor judgment, Noah countered with specific examples of improved morale, increased productivity, employee retention numbers that had actually improved since she stopped treating people as interchangeable resources. By the time the meeting concluded, Victor looked frustrated rather than triumphant, and Elise felt something settle in her chest that might have been confidence or might have been relief that she no longer had to fight these battles entirely alone. In the elevator afterwards, standing beside Noah while floors counted down toward the lobby, Elise found words emerging before she fully considered their implications. That was either very clever or very stupid, and I'm not sure which. Noah smiled, his expression suggesting he knew exactly which it was and accepted the risks anyway. Probably both, but watching him try to paint basic human decency as leadership failure made me angry enough not to care about self-preservation. The elevator doors opened and they stepped into the lobby where late afternoon sun painted marble and golds that made everything look softer, more forgiving. Chloe waited near the security desk with Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who had become auxiliary family, and when she saw them approach, She abandoned her coloring book and ran toward them with news that apparently couldn't wait. "Ee, guess what? I made you something new." She thrust a piece of paper at Elise, not from her new sketchbook, but from regular notebook paper, suggesting this creation had happened spontaneously rather than as careful art project. The drawing showed two stick figures holding hands beneath a rainbow, and beneath in Chloe's improving handwriting, "Best friends forever." Elise accepted the drawing with hands that trembled slightly, overcome by the casual certainty with which this child claimed her as permanent fixture rather than temporary interest. She crouched down to Chloe's level, unconcerned about her skirt, or the watching employees, or the way vulnerability felt increasingly natural. "Forever is a long time," she said gently. "Are you sure?" Chloe nodded with the absolute conviction only children possessed. "Forever means even when you're busy, and even when you're grumpy, and even when other people are mean to you. That's what best friends means." The logic was flawless, and Elise felt tears threatening for what felt like the 100th time in recent weeks. She pulled Chloe into a hug that was no longer awkward or uncertain, but simply necessary. This small person who had decided Elise deserved friendship and refused to accept evidence to the contrary. When they separated, Elise looked up to find Noah watching them with an expression that contained too many emotions to parse: affection, ingratitude, and something deeper that made her breath catch in ways that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with recognition that she was falling for him with the same inevitability that Chloe had decided they should be friends. "We should go," Mrs. Patterson had announced, clearly sensing that the adults needed private conversation space. "Homework time waits for no one, young lady." Chloe groaned, but hugged Elise once more before skipping toward the exit with the neighbor, leaving Noah and Elise standing alone in the lobby, while employees flowed around them on their way to evening commitments and lives that extended beyond these marble walls. "She really does love you," Noah said quietly, echoing his earlier observation from movie night. "Sometimes I think she decided you needed someone to believe in you, and once Chloe makes that kind of decision, she doesn't waver." "I think I needed exactly that," Elise admitted, though I didn't realize it until she handed me that first drawing and asked if we could be friends. They stood looking at each other for a beat that stretched longer than casual conversation required, and Elise felt the moment crystallizing into something significant, something that required acknowledgement, even if neither of them knew how to name what was happening between them. "Noah, But before she could finish, before she could articulate feelings that were growing too large to contain, alarms began shrieking throughout the building. Emergency lights flashed, and the automated evacuation announcement began its monotone loop, instructing employees to proceed to nearest exits in an orderly fashion. "Fire alarm," Noah said unnecessarily, already moving toward the stairs where people were beginning to gather. "Probably just a drill, but we should—" The explosion cut him off mid-sentence, a distant boom that made windows rattle and employees scream. Not a drill, something real and dangerous, and suddenly the careful conversation about feelings and friendship felt impossibly trivial compared to the immediate crisis of getting hundreds of people safely outside. Elise's training activated automatically CEO responsibilities, overriding personal concerns, as she moved toward the security desk, where guards were already coordinating with emergency services. Noah stayed at her side despite having no official role in crisis management, and together they helped organize evacuation while smoke began filtering through ventilation systems from somewhere below. The next 2 hours disappeared into chaos: fire department arrival, employee headcounts, anxious calls to families reassuring them everyone was safe. The explosion had originated in an electrical room 3 floors below ground level, apparently caused by equipment failure rather than anything sinister. No injuries, minimal structural damage, but enough disruption that the building would need to remain closed tomorrow while inspections confirmed safety. By the time Elise was cleared to leave, night had fully arrived, and Noah had already departed to collect Chloe from Mrs. Patterson's apartment and reassure his daughter that Daddy was fine, despite the scary building fire. Elise drove home through streets that felt different now, carrying awareness that catastrophe could arrive without warning, that all her careful planning and controlled environments couldn't actually protect against the randomness of equipment failures and emergency evacuations. Her apartment felt especially empty that night, all its expensive furniture and carefully curated aesthetic suddenly seeming like stage dressing for a performance no one was watching. She poured wine she didn't drink and stood at windows overlooking a city full of people going about their evening routines, and felt acutely aware that she had been moments away from telling Noah something important before the alarm interrupted something about feelings that were growing too intense to ignore, despite every professional boundary that should have prevented them. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that resolved into Noah when she opened the message. Chloe wanted me to make sure you're okay. Also me checking. Are you okay? The concern was simple and genuine, requiring no performance or careful response calculation. Elise typed back without overthinking. I'm fine, mostly just tired and weirdly shaken by something that ended up being minor. How's Chloe? His response came quickly. Already asleep, exhausted from worrying about you and her daddy and all the people in the building. She made me promise 3 times that you were really okay. Elise smiled at her phone, imagining Chloe's anxious interrogation, her need for repeated reassurance that her best friend E hadn't been hurt by explosions or fires, or any of the dangers that suddenly felt much more real than abstract. Tell her I'm completely fine and thinking about her, Elise typed. And thank you for checking on me. It means more than I know how to express. The response took longer this time, and when it arrived, the words felt weighted with everything they hadn't said in the lobby before the alarm interrupted. We care about you, Elise, both of us. Just wanted to make sure you knew that. She stared at the message for a long time, reading it multiple times and analyzing the shift from checking her safety to openly stating care, the vulnerability required to send such a text to your boss who held your employment in her hands. The message was professional suicide if she chose to make it so and instead represented trust that she wouldn't weaponize his honesty. I care about both of you, too, she typed back, then added, before courage could falter, more than is probably appropriate given the circumstances, but apparently I'm done pretending otherwise. The sent message hovered on her screen, impossible to recall, vulnerability transmitted across digital space to someone who could hurt her with it if he chose. She waited, phone clutched tight enough to leave impressions in her palm for his response. When it came, Noah's words were simple but carried implications that would take weeks to fully navigate. Good, because pretending was exhausting, and I think we're both tired of performing distance we don't actually feel. Elise smiled at her phone at this man who somehow understood exactly what she needed to hear and felt the last of her father's lessons about vulnerability and weakness finally irrevocably losing their hold over her choices. They texted for another hour, conversation flowing easier in digital space than it ever had face-to-face, discussing everything from the day's crisis to Chloe's latest artistic projects to the board politics that Victor Hammond clearly intended to escalate. By the time they finally said goodnight, Elise felt lighter than she had in years, carrying into sleep the knowledge that whatever came next, professionally or personally, she wouldn't be navigating it alone. The kiss happened on a Friday afternoon that had started unremarkably, the kind of day where routine threatened to swallow significance until crisis forced its hand. Elise was reviewing budget allocations when Miranda knocked with an expression that suggested trouble requiring immediate attention. There's a situation in the lobby. Noah Carter and some employees. Victor Hammond is involved. Elise was moving before her assistant finished speaking, instinct propelling her toward potential disaster faster than conscious thought could organize response strategy. The elevator descent felt interminable, each floor a separate eternity, while scenarios constructed themselves in her imagination: confrontation, termination, something requiring her intervention in ways that would expose exactly how much she cared about protecting someone who was supposed to be just another employee. The lobby scene materialized worse than anticipated. Victor stood near the security desk with Noah backed against the marble wall, Chloe clutching her father's hand with white-knuckled terror, while 2 security guards hovered uncertainly nearby. A small crowd had gathered, employees frozen mid-commute to witness whatever drama was unfolding. This is completely unacceptable, Victor was saying, his voice carrying that particular tone powerful men used when comfortable with their authority. Bringing children to work, taking excessive personal time, creating distractions that impact productivity. It demonstrates exactly the kind of poor judgment that reflects badly on leadership. Noah's jaw was clenched tight, his hand protective on Chloe's shoulder, but he said nothing, clearly understanding that contradicting a board member would only escalate the situation. Elise approached with measured steps, her heels announcing presence before words could. Victor turned, his expression shifting from aggressive to calculated as he registered her arrival. Miss Whitmore, I'm glad you're here. I was just explaining to Mr. Carter that his employment arrangements need immediate review. On what grounds? Elise's voice emerged cold and level, each word precisely calibrated to convey authority without revealing the fury building in her chest. On grounds that he's abusing flexible scheduling policies, that his personal circumstances are creating workplace disruptions, and frankly that his continued presence here raises questions about whether management is making decisions based on performance or personal favoritism. The accusation hung in the air, carefully phrased to attack both Noah and Elise simultaneously, to suggest that her recent behavioral changes were about attraction rather than growth, that any defense she offered would prove his point about compromised judgment. Around them, the gathered employees watched with the horrified fascination people reserve for public executions and corporate drama that would fuel gossip for months. Chloe had begun crying silently, tears streaming down her face while she tried to be brave for her father, and the sight of that small person, terrified by adult cruelty, shattered something fundamental in Elise's careful control. Mr. Carter's performance reviews are exemplary. Her words came sharp and precise, each syllable a surgical strike. He has prevented 3 major system failures, trained 6 junior developers who now exceed expectations, and worked more overtime than anyone in his department. His flexible scheduling is covered under company policy that applies equally to all employees with childcare responsibilities. She stepped closer to Victor, eliminating comfortable distance using proximity as weapon. And if you're suggesting that I'm incapable of making professional decisions without personal bias clouding my judgment, then say so directly, instead of hiding behind implication and attacking a subordinate who can't defend himself without risking his job. Victor's face reddened clearly, not expecting such direct confrontation in front of witnesses who would certainly spread this story throughout the building before day's end. I'm saying that recent events suggest your priorities have shifted in ways that concern shareholders. That perhaps personal feelings are interfering with the kind of ruthless decision-making that built this company. Then those shareholders are welcome to express their concerns through proper channels at the next board review, Elise replied. Until then, Mr. Carter's employment status is not subject to debate by board members who don't understand the actual value he provides to this organization. She turned to Noah, her expression softening in ways she no longer tried to hide. Take Chloe home. This day has been traumatic enough without making her stay here while adults argue about things that don't concern her. Noah nodded clearly, relieved to escape the situation, but before he could move, Victor played his final card. If you leave now, Carter, consider it abandonment of your position. I'll make sure termination paperwork is filed before you reach your car. The threat was empty. Victor lacked authority to fire anyone directly, but it carried enough weight that Noah froze, caught between protecting his daughter and protecting their income. The impossible mathematics of single parenthood colliding with corporate politics in ways that felt deliberately cruel. Elise felt something inside her snap, some final restraint that had been holding her back from acknowledging what everyone in this lobby already understood. She closed the remaining distance to Victor with speed that made him step back reflexively. You want to discuss my judgment? Fine. Let's discuss judgment. You've spent months trying to undermine my leadership because you can't accept that a woman can run this company better than you ever could. You've turned board meetings into personal attacks and used shareholder concerns as cover for your own ambition. And now you're threatening to fire a valued employee because you think hurting him will hurt me. Her voice dropped to something dangerous. You're absolutely right. It would hurt me. Because I care about Noah Carter and his daughter in ways that have nothing to do with quarterly reports or strategic planning. I care about them as human beings who deserve to be treated with dignity rather than being used as ammunition in your pathetic power play. The lobby had gone silent, every person present, understanding they were witnessing something significant, some moment that would be analyzed and discussed and probably embellished in the retelling. Elise knew she should stop, should retreat behind professional boundaries, and handle this through proper channels rather than airing personal feelings in front of an audience that would remember every word. But she was tired. Tired of performing distance. She didn't feel tired of pretending vulnerability was weakness, tired of letting fear of her father's lessons dictate choices that left her isolated and miserable despite every professional achievement. So instead of retreating, she turned to Noah. I'm sorry for the mockery, for making your life harder, for taking months to recognize what your daughter saw immediately, that you're exactly the kind of person worth knowing. Noah stared at her, confusion and hope warring across his expression, clearly uncertain where this confession was leading or what it meant for his precarious employment situation. I don't know how to do this perfectly. Elise's voice carried to every corner of the marble lobby, burning bridges she could never rebuild. I don't know how to balance caring about people with the ruthlessness this job sometimes requires. But I'm tired of pretending I don't care. I'm tired of building walls to protect myself from exactly the kind of connection you and Chloe have been offering. She stepped closer, her hand reaching for his in a gesture that was both plea and declaration, palm up and asking rather than demanding. So I'm choosing to stop pretending. Right now, in front of all these witnesses, I'm choosing connection over protection and vulnerability over whatever calculating distance my father tried to teach me was strength. The moment stretched, crystallizing into something that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Noah looked at their almost touching hands, at Chloe crying against his leg, at Victor's furious expression, and the gathered employees with their phones probably recording this entire disaster for posterity. Then he took her hand. The contact was electric, palm against palm, fingers intertwining with the certainty of puzzle pieces that had been searching for each other without knowing the shape they were meant to form. Elise felt her breath catch, her entire world narrowing to the warmth of his skin against hers, and the way he was looking at her like she had just done something impossibly brave rather than probably ending both their careers. Elise, he said quietly, and her name and his voice carried weight that formal address had never achieved. She didn't let him finish, didn't give him time to list all the reasons this was complicated or impossible or destined to create problems neither of them could solve. Instead, she reached up with her free hand and pulled him down by his collar, her lips finding his in a kiss that was desperate and tender and completely inevitable. For one suspended heartbeat, nothing moved except them, her mouth against his hand tightening around hers, the world narrowing to contact points that felt simultaneously new and familiar, like coming home to a place she had never been, but had been searching for without knowing it existed. Then the lobby erupted. Gasps and whispers, and at least 3 phone cameras capturing this moment for immediate distribution across social media and office gossip channels. Victor's voice raised in outrage that nobody was listening to. Security guards uncertain whether to intervene in something that was technically inappropriate, but not actually threatening. And somewhere near the elevators, barely visible through the crowd, Chloe had stopped crying and was watching with wide-eyed delight that suggested her 7-year-old understanding of the world had just been validated in ways adults had spent weeks making unnecessarily complicated. Elise pulled back slowly, her forehead resting against Noah's for a moment, while they both remembered how to breathe, acutely aware they had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had made their private feelings devastatingly public in ways that would have professional consequences neither of them could fully anticipate. I should probably regret that, she whispered quiet enough that only he could hear. Do you? No, Noah smiled small and private despite their very public audience and squeezed her hand once before releasing it, returning them to appropriate distance that felt wrong after the intimacy of touch. For what it's worth, I don't regret it either, though we should probably talk about what happens next. What happened next materialized with brutal speed. Victor stormed toward his car, already on his phone to other board members, spreading his version of events before Elise could control the narrative. Employees scattered to desks and offices where they could frantically text friends about what they had just witnessed. Miranda appeared with damage control strategies and calendar adjustments to accommodate the crisis that was certainly coming. And Chloe ran across the marble floor to wrap her arms around Elise's waist, her voice high and excited and completely unaware of the professional catastrophe that kiss had probably triggered. I knew it. I told Daddy you liked each other. Mrs. Patterson said I was being silly, but I knew Elise crouched down, matching eye level with this small person who had orchestrated this entire transformation through persistent friendship and unconditional faith that adults could be better than their worst behaviors. You're very clever, she said, brushing tears from Chloe's cheeks with gentle fingers, and very brave for staying calm when that mean man was being scary. He was mean, Chloe agreed with the moral certainty only children possessed. But you and Daddy were brave too. That's what heroes do in stories. They're brave even when they're scared. The logic was flawless, and Elise felt something warm settle in her chest despite the chaos swirling around them. She stood taking Chloe's offered hand and met Noah's eyes across the diminishing crowd. "We should talk," she said, "properly, about what this means and how we navigate the disaster I just created. My apartment. Tonight." After Chloe's in bed, Noah's tone was serious but not angry, understanding that adult conversations required privacy that 7-year-olds shouldn't witness. "Assuming you're not too busy dealing with board member meltdowns and public relations nightmares. I'll be there," Elise promised, and watched them leave through revolving doors that led to parking structures in the outside world where consequences lived. The weekend that followed was exactly the professional disaster Elise had anticipated, but somehow less emotionally catastrophic than she'd feared. Victor called an emergency board meeting for Monday morning, his message carefully worded to suggest leadership crisis requiring immediate intervention. Media outlets picked up the story through social media posts from employees who couldn't resist sharing dramatic footage. CEO kisses subordinate in dramatic lobby confrontation went viral in tech industry circles, spawning think pieces about workplace romance and power dynamics, and whether Elise Whitmore had finally cracked under the pressure of running a Fortune 500 company. But Friday night, sitting in Noah's small kitchen after Chloe had been tucked into bed with extra hugs and reassurance that nobody was in actual trouble, Elise found clarity she hadn't expected. "They're going to force a choice." Noah's voice was quiet, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold during their first hour of conversation. "Victor will frame it as either you end this, whatever this is, or you step down as CEO. Probably," Elise agreed, staring at her own untouched coffee. "He's been looking for leverage for months. I just handed him perfect ammunition. So what do we do?" The question hung between them, weighted with all the implications they were still learning to navigate. Elise looked at this man who had defended her to powerful people, who had raised an extraordinary daughter while managing impossible circumstances, who had somehow convinced her that vulnerability might be strength rather than weakness. "I don't know yet, but I know I won't let him force me to hurt you or Chloe to protect my position." "There has to be another way." Noah reached across the small table, his hand covering hers with warmth that had become familiar over weeks of careful reconstruction. "Whatever you decide, we'll figure it out together. You don't have to sacrifice everything you've built to prove a point about corporate culture or workplace ethics." "But maybe I do," Elise replied. "Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. Someone with actual authority choosing people over profit, demonstrating that caring about employees isn't weakness, but the foundation of real leadership." They talked into early morning, exploring options and scenarios, acknowledging fears neither wanted to voice, but both understood were valid. By the time Elise finally left, exhausted but strangely hopeful, they had no concrete plan but shared understanding that whatever came next would be navigated together, rather than in the isolation Elise had spent years perfecting. Saturday brought unexpected support. Margaret Chen called the board member who had spoken up during Victor's previous attack and offered information about other shareholders who were increasingly uncomfortable with Victor's tactics. Several employees sent messages expressing support, carefully worded to avoid seeming like they were choosing sides, but clearly indicating they appreciated seeing their CEO demonstrate humanity rather than calculated ruthlessness. And Chloe created another drawing. Noah texted a photo Saturday afternoon. Chloe's newest masterpiece showed 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a rainbow with words carefully printed below. "Being brave means choosing love, even when it's scary." Elise stared at the image for a long time, at this 7-year-old's distillation of complex adult emotions into primary colors and simple truth. She saved the photo and used it as her phone background, wanting the reminder visible every time she checked messages or reviewed documents, preparing for Monday's confrontation. Sunday passed in preparation that felt less like defensive strategy and more like gathering courage. Elise reviewed company bylaws and board procedures, mapping out exactly what authority Victor actually had versus what he was claiming. She called her lawyer a shark of a woman who specialized in corporate governance and had been on retainer for years but rarely needed. And she wrote a speech, drafting and redrafting until the words felt true rather than tactical, until she could read them aloud without flinching at the vulnerability they exposed. Monday morning arrived with the inevitability of weather systems dragging Elise from shallow sleep into a day that would determine whether her choice in that lobby would cost her everything she had spent years building. She dressed with particular care, not armor this time, but clothing that felt authentic, silk blouse in deep blue that Chloe had once identified as her favorite color, tailored slacks that projected authority without performing aggression. She looked in the mirror and saw someone who had changed in ways that went beyond professional transformation, someone who might actually survive what came next because she was no longer fighting alone. The executive boardroom was already full when she arrived, every seat occupied by members who had gathered to judge whether Friday's public display disqualified her from continued leadership. Victor sat at the far end looking smugly confident, clearly expecting today would end with her resignation or termination. Elise took her position at the table's head and waited while the room settled into expectant silence. When she finally spoke, her voice carried steady and clear. Before we begin formal proceedings, I want to address Friday's incident directly and completely. What happened in the lobby was inappropriate for a workplace setting. It violated professional boundaries and created a situation that rightfully concerns anyone worried about power dynamics and employee welfare. Around the table, board members nodded, some satisfied that she was acknowledging the problem, others clearly waiting for the defense they knew was coming. However, Elise continued her gaze, moving to meet each person's eyes in turn, framing that kiss as the only problem misses the larger context. For months, I've been told that showing empathy toward employees, defending them from harassment, or acknowledging their humanity somehow undermines my authority. I've been criticized for allowing flexible scheduling that supports working parents, for creating programs that treat people like human beings rather than interchangeable resources. She paused, letting the words settle. Victor has framed this as a leadership crisis. He's argued that my recent behavior demonstrates compromised judgment and emotional instability. And he's technically correct, my judgment has been compromised, but not by attraction to a subordinate. It's been compromised by spending so many years believing that cruelty was strength, that isolation was protection, that the only way to lead effectively was to eliminate any emotion that might make me vulnerable to criticism, exactly like what I'm facing today. Margaret Chen leaned forward, her expression interested rather than hostile, and Elise felt small hope that perhaps not every bridge had burned on Friday. "What are you proposing?" Margaret asked. Elise pulled out the document she had been drafting all weekend, passing copies around the table with steady hands that betrayed none of her internal terror. "I'm proposing we implement formal policies around workplace relationships that protect both parties and make expectations clear. I'm recommending that Noah Carter be transferred to a different reporting structure so there's no direct authority dynamic. And I'm suggesting that if the board believes my personal life makes me unfit for leadership, then they should vote based on actual performance metrics rather than assumptions about whether women can separate professional responsibilities from personal feelings." Victor cleared his throat, his expression still confident, but perhaps slightly less certain than when the meeting began. "That's all very reasonable sounding, but it doesn't address the fundamental issue. You kissed a subordinate in front of dozens of witnesses. That's not just poor judgment, it's a liability nightmare." "You're right," Elise agreed, surprising him with concession. It was poor judgment in execution. But the feeling itself, caring about someone who works here, wanting to protect him from harassment, choosing to acknowledge that employees are human beings worthy of dignity, that's not poor judgment. That's recognizing that leadership requires more than strategic planning and budget management. It requires actually giving a damn about the people whose lives depend on decisions we make in rooms like this. She stood unable to remain seated while delivering the most important part of her prepared remarks. "My father built this company on the principle that sentiment was weakness and emotional distance was the only way to make hard decisions without being compromised by caring about consequences. He taught me that love and trust made you vulnerable, that the only way to survive in business was to eliminate anything that could be used against you." Her voice gained strength as she continued building toward the truth she had been avoiding for years. He was wrong, or at least incomplete. Yes, caring makes you vulnerable. Yes, emotional investment means risking hurt. But eliminating those things doesn't make you strong, it makes you cruel. It makes you the kind of leader who can destroy lives without flinching because you've convinced yourself that distance equals wisdom. Around the table, several board members were nodding, including two who had previously seemed aligned with Victor's position. Elise felt momentum shifting, not dramatically, but enough to suggest she might survive this after all. "So here's my position," she concluded. I will not end my relationship with Noah Carter to preserve my job. I will not apologize for caring about an employee who has demonstrated nothing but competence and dedication. I will implement proper policies to ensure no conflicts of interest exist going forward. And if this board believes those steps aren't sufficient, then I'll resign and you can find a CEO who's comfortable ruling through fear and treating people like expendable resources. She sat down, her prepared speech delivered nothing left to do but wait while the board decided whether her leadership was worth preserving, despite the messy humanity she had finally acknowledged. Victor opened his mouth to respond, but Margaret spoke first. I move we take a 15-minute recess before voting on any proposals. This discussion deserves more consideration than immediate reaction. The motion passed and the board members filed out in clusters, whispering conversations that would determine Elise's fate. She remained in her seat, suddenly exhausted by the emotional expenditure the speech had required, by the vulnerability of laying out her transformation for inspection by people who had never wanted her to be anything other than her father's ruthless successor. Her phone buzzed, a text from Noah. Whatever happens in there, you're already the bravest person I know. Chloe wanted me to send you this. The attached image showed a new drawing, a stick figure wearing a crown standing tall with a smile surrounded by hearts. Below in Chloe's handwriting, queens can be brave and nice. Elise felt tears threatening, but forced them back through discipline that was becoming harder to maintain. This 7-year-old had understood something essential, that boardrooms and corporate strategy had obscured that strength and kindness weren't opposites, but complements, that the best leaders were brave enough to care, even when caring made them vulnerable. The board reconvened with faces that revealed nothing, and for 20 minutes they debated points. Elise couldn't quite follow her exhaustion, making their voices blur into background noise. Finally, Margaret called for a vote on Elise's proposal to implement relationship policies and transfer reporting structures. The vote passed. Not unanimously, Victor and 2 allies voted no, but with enough margin that Elise's position was secure, at least for now. Victor stood, his face dark with barely contained fury. This is a mistake. You're setting precedent that emotion matters more than stability, that personal feelings can override professional obligations. When this experiment fails, don't say you weren't warned. He left without waiting for response, his departure somehow confirming what Elise had suspected. This had never been about proper corporate governance or protecting shareholder interests. It had been about punishing her for becoming someone who cared about things beyond quarterly reports and stock prices. The meeting concluded with logistics policies to be drafted, structures to be adjusted, expectations to be clarified. Elise participated with professional competence while internally celebrating survival awareness that she had kept both her position and her integrity by refusing to choose between them. When she finally escaped to her office, she found Noah waiting with Chloe, both sitting in the reception area with the patience of people who understood that important things took time. Chloe jumped up when she saw Elise, eyes wide with question. Did the mean people fire you, no sweetheart? Elise crouched down, gathering this small person into a hug that felt necessary and right despite the professional setting. They decided I could keep being the boss as long as I follow new rules. Rules are good, Chloe declared with absolute certainty. Rules keep people safe. Exactly right, Elise agreed, then looked up at Noah with a smile that felt genuine rather than tactical. We should talk, properly, about new rules and reporting structures and how we navigate this without creating problems for either of us. My apartment tonight, Noah offered, then glanced at his daughter. Though fair warning, this one has opinions about everything and will probably interrupt constantly. That's okay, Elise said. I've learned that sometimes the best insights come from people who haven't learned to overcomplicate simple truths. They left together, 3 people walking through the lobby where Friday's kiss had happened, where gossip had sparked and consequences had materialized, and somehow everyone had survived. Employees watched with interest but stayed professional, clearly understanding that whatever was happening between their CEO and the single dad from engineering was now official rather than scandalous. That evening, after Chloe had been fed and bathed and tucked into bed, with extra stories, Elise and Noah sat on a small couch with wine and exhaustion, and the strange relief that came from surviving crisis that could have destroyed everything. So what happens now? Noah asked, his hand finding hers in the space between them. Now we follow the rules we created, Elise replied. You transfer to a different department, we document everything to show there's no favoritism, and we figure out how to build something real without letting professional boundaries collapse completely. And us, this thing we're starting? Elise turned to face him fully, her free hand reaching up to touch his cheek with the kind of casual intimacy that weeks ago would have been unthinkable. Us means taking it slowly and being careful, and probably making mistakes we learn from. It means letting Chloe set the pace since she's the one with the most to lose if we mess this up. It means choosing each other every day even when it's complicated. She leaned closer, her forehead resting against his. But mostly it means acknowledging that what started as your daughter asking if we could be friends has become something none of us expected and all of us need. Noah kissed her then soft and deliberate promise rather than passion, and Elise felt the last of her father's lessons about vulnerability finally completely lose their power over her choices. When they separated, both smiling in the dim apartment lighting, Elise thought about the journey from mockery to this moment, from the woman who couldn't understand why someone would bring their child to work, to someone who now understood that love made you vulnerable, but also made you whole, that caring was risk, but isolation was guarantee of misery. Can I ask you something? Noah's voice was quiet, serious in a way that suggested the question mattered. Anything. When you were standing in that boardroom defending your choice to care about people, were you scared? Elise considered this, remembering her racing heart and trembling hands, the terror that she was sacrificing everything her father had built for something that might not even work. Terrified, she admitted, but less scared than I would have been knowing I'd chosen the easy path of distance and spent the rest of my career wondering what I'd missed. Noah smiled, squeezing her hand. Chloe was right. You really are brave. Braver than you give yourself credit for. I learned from the best, Elise replied. Your daughter taught me that asking to be someone's friend requires more courage than most corporate negotiations. Everything else just followed from that first drawing she gave me. They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had started as adversaries and somehow found their way to partnership, while in the next room a 7-year-old slept peacefully, dreaming dreams where adults were simple and love conquered complications and best friends really did last forever. Outside Noah's apartment, Boston continued its evening routines, traffic and restaurants, and 1,000 lives being lived beyond these walls. But inside this small space, three people had created something that mattered more than quarterly reports or board politics or any of the professional achievements Elise had once thought defined success. They had created family, not through traditional structures or official declarations, but through choice and vulnerability, and a child's unwavering faith that grown-ups could be better if they just tried hard enough. And as Elise sat beside Noah, planning logistics and policies and all the practical details that would make their relationship sustainable, she felt gratitude for every moment that had led here, even the mockery, even the mistakes, even the painful lessons that had taught her what she actually needed. She pulled out her phone and looked at Chloe's latest drawing one more time, at the crowned stick figure surrounded by hearts, at the caption declaring that queens could be brave and nice. The little girl was right about everything, and Elise was finally terrifyingly, wonderfully ready to prove it.